Welcome to the channel. We're so glad you're here. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to click like and subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. Your support helps us create more awesome videos for you. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Enjoy the video. The Whispers of Blackwater Mire, a night of primal fear. This recollection, this intrusion of the uncanny into the mundane, is something I revisit almost daily. Even though years have passed since the incident, and the sharp edges of memory have softened with time, the core of the experience, the raw, visceral terror, remains vividly etched in my mind. It's a memory that surfaces unbidden, often triggered by the most innocuous of things: the rustling of leaves, the hoot of an owl, the sound of water lapping against a shore. It's a constant reminder of a night when the veil between the familiar and the unknown seemed to thin, revealing a glimpse of something truly terrifying. It was a January night, the air crisp and cold, the kind of night that makes you want to huddle indoors, wrapped in a warm blanket with a cup of something hot. But we, a group of restless, bored teenagers, were seeking something more stimulating. One of us, I can't recall who, suggested a bonfire. It was a seemingly harmless idea, a way to break the monotony of a winter evening, to inject a bit of excitement into our otherwise predictable lives. The proposed fuel for this bonfire? A discarded Christmas tree, brown and brittle, its needles shedding with every gust of wind. It was a symbol of a season past, a relic of festive cheer now destined for a fiery demise. Someone, perhaps fueled by a youthful disregard for consequences, made the flippant remark, "It's only illegal if we get caught." It was a statement that, in retrospect, perfectly encapsulated the reckless abandon of our teenage years, the naive belief that we were somehow immune to the rules, to the potential dangers that lurked in the shadows. And so, with that dubious logic guiding our actions, we set out to find a suitable location for our clandestine bonfire. My friend, Sarah, a girl with a mischievous glint in her eyes and a penchant for adventure, claimed to know of a place, a secluded spot where we were unlikely to attract the attention of law enforcement. The only caveat, she explained, was that we had to wait for the cover of darkness, for the cloak of night to conceal our illicit activities. What Sarah failed to mention, what she conveniently omitted from her description, was the nature of this secluded spot. It was not, as we had perhaps envisioned, a deserted field or a hidden clearing in the woods. It was, in fact, a swamp, a sprawling, murky expanse of water, reeds, and tangled vegetation, crisscrossed by a network of wooden walkways, designed for daytime nature enthusiasts, not for nocturnal teenage arsonists. As we drove up to the designated area, the absence of any artificial light was immediately apparent. No streetlights, no floodlights, no welcoming glow emanating from any nearby buildings. This was not a place that was meant to be visited after dark. Yet, here we were, a group of restless teenagers, armed with a dead Christmas tree and a reckless disregard for potential consequences. Once we had arrived and, with considerable effort, dragged the tree to a somewhat suitable location near the edge of the swamp, another, even more ill-advised idea took root in our collective consciousness. One of our friends, emboldened by the darkness and the thrill of our clandestine activity, suggested we explore the darkened trails, the wooden walkways that snaked through the inky blackness of the swamp. No flashlights, he proposed, just the faint, ethereal glow of the moon to guide our way. We all hesitated, a collective intake of breath, a moment of silent contemplation. The forest, the swamp, seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, palpable sense of unease. But the allure of the unknown, the thrill of venturing into the darkness, ultimately proved too strong to resist. We agreed, our youthful bravado masking a deep-seated apprehension. Using the headlights of our cars as a makeshift beacon, we identified two entrances leading into the heart of the swamp. The plan, hatched with the typical impulsiveness of teenagers, was to enter through one path and emerge from the other, completing a circuit through the mysterious, unknown terrain. Naturally, Sarah and I, ever the conspirators, saw this as an opportunity for mischief. There was a boy in our group, Mark, whom Sarah had a particular fondness for. They engaged in a constant, playful banter, a flirtatious dance of witty retorts and teasing remarks. Sarah had, through careful observation, discovered that Mark, despite his outward bravado, was, at heart, a bit of a scaredy cat. And so, plan was hatched. I would surreptitiously detach myself from the group, making my way to the exit of the path, the point where they would eventually emerge. I would then position myself strategically, hidden in the shadows, and, at the opportune moment, jump out, scaring the living daylights out of Mark. It was a classic prank, juvenile and harmless, yet it filled us with a giddy anticipation. As the rest of the group, oblivious to our scheme, headed down one of the entrances, I slipped away, stealthily navigating my way towards the opposite end of the path. The swamp, now fully enveloped in darkness, was alive with sound. The croaking of frogs, a deep, resonant chorus, punctuated the night air. Insects buzzed and chirped, their tiny voices creating a constant, high-pitched hum. Creatures, unseen and unknown, rustled in the undergrowth, their movements adding a layer of unsettling mystery to the atmosphere. Several times, I heard the distinct splash of water, the sound of a frog, or perhaps something larger, plopping into the murky depths. The blackness of the night didn't bother me initially. I was too focused on the impending prank, on the anticipated look of terror on Mark's face, on the inevitable screams that would follow. It was a childish, silly game, but it provided a welcome distraction from the underlying unease that permeated the swamp. I walked and walked, my pace quickening with each passing moment. Surely I should have encountered the group by now. Where were they? Had they taken a wrong turn? Had they abandoned the plan altogether? I stopped, my breath catching in my throat, straining my ears for any sign of their approach. But all I heard was the symphony of the swamp, the relentless chorus of nocturnal creatures, and then silence. A profound, unsettling silence. It was as if the swamp itself was holding its breath, waiting, anticipating something. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. My heart began to pound, a frantic drumbeat against the oppressive stillness. And then I heard it, a sound, distinct and unsettling, emanating from somewhere in front of me, somewhere in the inky blackness of the swamp. It was a sloshing sound, a gentle, rhythmic lapping, like someone wading slowly through shallow water. But it didn't sound like a frog or a fish or any other creature I could readily identify. It was something different, something larger. I froze, my body rigid with fear, my senses on high alert. The sloshing sound continued, growing closer, more distinct. And then, another sound joined the chorus. A thud, heavy and resonant, against the wooden planks of the walkway, causing the entire structure to vibrate slightly. It was followed by a series of slapping noises, wet and fleshy, like flippers or webbed feet striking the damp wood. My mind raced, desperately trying to identify the source of these unsettling sounds. Was it an alligator? A large turtle? Some other, unknown creature that lurked in the depths of the swamp? Curiosity, a natural human instinct, warred with a growing sense of primal terror. I wanted to know, to see, to understand. But the fear, the overwhelming, visceral fear, was rapidly gaining the upper hand. In that moment, rational thought abandoned me. I was no longer a curious teenager, eager to pull a prank on a friend. I was a creature of instinct, driven by a singular, overwhelming urge to escape. I turned and ran. I fled through the darkness, my feet pounding against the wooden planks of the walkway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back, I didn't dare. I just ran, as fast as my legs could carry me, away from the unseen horror that lurked in the depths of the swamp. When I finally emerged from the forest, blinking in the sudden glare of the headlights, my friends were there, waiting for me, their faces etched with a mixture of concern and confusion. Apparently, after realizing I was no longer with them, they had grown worried. Sarah, bless her heart, had even confessed to our planned prank. revealing our childish scheme in a desperate attempt to locate me. They had been about to embark on a search to venture into the darkness I had just fled, when I suddenly appeared, breathless and terrified. It wasn't until later, after we had returned to the relative safety of our cars, that we discovered the crucial detail that had been overlooked. The two paths we had seen, the two entrances leading into the swamp, did not, as we had assumed, connect. They led in entirely different directions, a fact that would have been readily apparent had we bothered to consult a map or, use a little common sense. As for what I encountered in that swamp, what produced those unsettling sounds, I have no definitive answer. My friends, understandably skeptical, dismissed my experience as the product of an overactive imagination, fueled by darkness and fear. They suggested it was likely just a frog, a large turtle, or some other harmless creature of the swamp. And perhaps they were right. Over the years, I've often tried to convince myself that their explanation was the correct one, that I had simply misinterpreted the sounds, that my fear had amplified the ordinary into something extraordinary. But the memory of that night, the sheer visceral terror I felt, the distinct sounds of something large and unseen moving through the water, the thudding and slapping on the wooden walkway, it all remains too vivid, too real, to be dismissed as mere imagination. It was, without a doubt, one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, a stark reminder of the hidden dangers that lurk in the darkness, of the unseen forces that can transform the familiar into the terrifying. And so, I am left with this lingering question, this unresolved mystery, a constant reminder of that night in Blackwater Mire, when the whispers of the swamp revealed a darkness that I can never fully forget, and will likely never fully understand. And while some may say it was just an animal, that doesn't explain the immense fear, that instinct that told me it was time to flee. The Facebook Phantom, a digital haunting. This story unfolds in the digital age, a time when our lives are inextricably intertwined with the online world, a realm where connections are forged, friendships are maintained, and, occasionally, shadows lurk. It was about 5 years ago when Chloe, was 15 years old. My life revolved around the typical teenage concerns: school, friends, and the ever-present drama of navigating the complexities of adolescence. My primary mode of communication, my window to the social world, was Facebook. At the time, I was living with my mother in a modest apartment in a medium-sized city. My mother, a hardworking woman, often worked long hours, leaving me to my own devices for extended periods. This lack of adult supervision, while not entirely unwelcome, created a sense of vulnerability, a feeling of being exposed to the potential dangers of the online world. My evenings were often spent in solitary pursuits, consuming an endless stream of YouTube videos, engaging in the mindless scroll through social media feeds, and indulging in my culinary staple, macaroni and cheese. It was a simple, comforting routine, a shield against the loneliness and boredom that often crept in during those long, unsupervised hours. One such evening, as I settled into my usual routine, my phone buzzed, signaling an incoming message. I didn't have a large circle of friends, and the only person who regularly contacted me was my mother. But she was at work, her shift stretching late into the night, so I knew it couldn't be her. I paused the YouTube video, a documentary about the mating rituals of some obscure species of bird, and set aside my bowl of mac and cheese, the cheesy aroma still lingering in the air. I picked up my phone, my curiosity piqued. The screen illuminated, revealing a Facebook message from an unfamiliar sender. "Hi, Chloe," the message read. It was a simple, innocuous greeting, yet it sent a faint ripple of unease through me. I didn't recognize the name. The profile picture was generic, and there was no immediate indication of how this person might know me. I considered ignoring it, dismissing it as a random message, a case of mistaken identity. But my curiosity, that persistent, nagging voice that often leads us down paths we later regret, got the better of me. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The message was so bland, so devoid of any context. Could be anyone, a classmate, a distant relative, a friend of a friend. Or it could be something else entirely, something less benign. I put my phone back down, deciding to focus on my dinner and the captivating documentary about avian courtship. Another few minutes passed, the silence of the apartment broken only by the chirping of birds on the screen and the occasional clinking of my fork against the bowl. Then my phone buzzed again. It was the same person, the same unfamiliar name. "How are you doing, Chloe?" This time, the unease intensified. The persistence, the seemingly harmless yet vaguely unsettling nature of the messages, triggered a primal alarm bell in my mind. This wasn't a casual greeting. This was something else. I decided to respond, cautiously, my fingers typing out a hesitant reply. "I'm fine," I wrote. "Who is this?" There was no immediate response. The silence stretched, amplifying my growing sense of apprehension. I finished my dinner, the cheesy comfort of the mac and cheese now replaced by a knot of anxiety in my stomach. I watched a few more videos, trying to distract myself, but the unanswered question lingered, a persistent, nagging doubt that refused to be silenced. I went to bed, the unsettling encounter replaying in my mind. My mother had always warned me about the dangers of the internet, the potential for online predators, the risks of engaging with strangers. She had told me stories of catfishing, of identity theft, of online harassment. These warnings, once dismissed as the overprotective ramblings of a concerned parent, now took on a new, chilling significance. Had I become a target? Was this seemingly innocuous message the opening gambit in some elaborate, sinister scheme? My imagination, fueled by fear and uncertainty, conjured up a host of terrifying scenarios. The next evening followed a similar pattern. I was home alone, my mother working another late shift, my dinner consisting of the familiar, comforting staple of mac and cheese. I was engrossed in another YouTube video, this time a compilation of cute animal clips, when my phone buzzed, announcing the arrival of another Facebook message. My heart skipped a beat. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the phone, my mind racing. Was it him? Was it the same stranger, returning to continue his unsettling game? I picked up the phone, my fingers trembling slightly. The screen illuminated, revealing a message from the same unfamiliar sender. "Are you enjoying your macaroni and cheese?" The words hit me like a physical blow. My breath caught in my throat, and a wave of cold fear washed over me. This was no longer a random message, a case of mistaken identity. This was something far more sinister, far more personal. How did he know? How did he know what I was eating? Was he watching me? Was he nearby? I responded, my voice laced with a mixture of anger and fear. "Who is this?" I demanded, my fingers typing furiously. Almost instantly, another message arrived. "I'm watching you," it read, "and I know you're alone." The words sent a shiver of pure terror down my spine. My heart hammered against my ribs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I felt exposed, vulnerable, utterly and completely alone. My mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of the situation. Was it a friend playing a cruel, twisted joke? It was possible. My friends knew my routine, my penchant for mac and cheese. They knew I was often home alone. But this felt different. This felt malicious. The timing, the specific details, the unsettling tone of the messages. It all pointed to something far more sinister than a harmless prank. And the fact that it was late fall, the days growing shorter, the darkness creeping in earlier, only amplified my fear. The shadows outside my window seemed to deepen, to take on a menacing quality. My mother's warnings echoed in my mind, her words of caution now taking on a terrifying new resonance. I had been naive, complacent, dismissing her concerns as the overprotective anxieties of a parent. But now I realized, with a chilling certainty, that she had been right. The internet, this seemingly innocuous tool of connection and communication, was also a breeding ground for darkness, a place where predators lurked, waiting to prey on the vulnerable. The next message arrived, shattering any lingering hope that this was just a harmless misunderstanding. "I'm watching you," it repeated, the words dripping with a chilling menace. "And I'll be watching you when you go to sleep tonight." I turned off my phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal urge to flee, to escape this unseen threat. But where could I go? I was alone, trapped in my own home, with a stalker, a predator, watching my every move. I got up, my legs unsteady, and went through the apartment, locking every door, closing every window, drawing every curtain. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, barricading myself against an unseen enemy. I finished my nightly routine, my heart still pounding, my mind racing. I went to bed, but sleep was impossible. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak, every groan of the old apartment building, my senses on high alert. Before drifting off, I blocked the person from my Facebook account. This had to stop. It was escalating quickly. I needed to take control of the situation. The next day, I woke up early, my eyes heavy from lack of sleep. The events of the previous night replayed in my mind, fueling my anxiety and fear. I walked to school, a 20-minute trek through the city streets. My senses heightened, my eyes constantly scanning my surroundings. Everything went fine at school. It was a normal, uneventful day, filled with the usual routine of classes, lectures, and the mundane interactions of teenage life. But the normalcy was a facade, a thin veneer concealing the underlying terror that gnawed at my gut. I struggled to concentrate, my mind preoccupied with the unsettling messages, with the unseen threat that loomed over me. After school, I decided to stop at a fast food restaurant, a brief respite from the anxieties that plagued me. I sat there for half an hour, trying to lose myself in the mindless chatter of other patrons, in the familiar, comforting smells of greasy food. Then, as I was walking the rest of the way home, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. A car, a dark-colored sedan, seemed to be following me. It drove past me slowly, then turned around and drove past me again, and again, and again. It was already getting dark, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows on the pavement. I couldn't be sure it was the same car, but the coincidence was too unsettling to ignore. My heart began to race, my pace quickening. As I approached the parking lot of my apartment complex, the car drove past me one final time, and then a voice, loud and menacing, yelled out the window, "Enjoy your mac and cheese, Chloe." I turned, my eyes scanning the street, but the car was already turning the corner, its brake lights flashing briefly before it disappeared from sight. I was paralyzed with fear. My mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of what was happening. Who was this person? How did he know my name? How did he know where I lived? The only person I could think of, the only person who might have a motive to harass me, was my ex-boyfriend, Mark. We had broken up a month earlier, a messy, acrimonious split fueled by accusations of infidelity. He had sworn it was a mistake, that he only wanted to be with me, but I had refused to take him back, and his friends had told me he was still deeply hurt, still obsessed with me. Could it be him? Was he stalking me, harassing me, trying to terrorize me into submission? It seemed plausible, yet couldn't be sure. I deleted my Facebook account, cutting off the primary means of communication this unknown stalker had been using. I spent the next year in a state of heightened anxiety, constantly looking over my shoulder, fearing the return of the Facebook phantom. But he never reappeared. The messages stopped. The car disappeared. And eventually, the fear began to fade, replaced by a lingering sense of unease, a constant reminder of the vulnerability of the digital age, of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of the seemingly innocuous world of social media. The experience left me scarred, forever wary of online interactions, forever aware of the potential for unseen threats to intrude upon our lives. And it left me with a chilling question, a question that continues to haunt me to this day. Who was the Facebook phantom, and what were his true intentions? The lens of shadows. Detective Miles Corbin was a man of logic and observation. His world was one of concrete evidence. of fingerprints and timelines and witness statements. He dealt in the tangible, the verifiable, the things that could be photographed, documented, and entered into a case file. The supernatural held no place in his meticulously ordered reality. That was until the camera arrived. It appeared on his desk one dreary Monday morning, unannounced and unexplained. A plain, cardboard box, addressed to him in a stark, block-lettered script. Inside, nestled in a bed of crumpled newspaper, was a camera. Not a modern digital model, but an antique, a relic from a bygone era. It was heavy, solid, made of metal and glass, with a worn leather strap that spoke of countless unseen hands. Miles was a private investigator, specializing in insurance fraud and infidelity cases. He occasionally received odd items from anonymous sources, usually trinkets or documents related to ongoing investigations. He assumed this was another one of those, a piece of potential evidence, perhaps, or a misguided attempt at a bribe. He examined the camera closely. It was a vintage Voigtlander, a model he vaguely recognized from old photography magazines. The lens had a few minor scratches around the rim, and the viewfinder was slightly cloudy, but otherwise it seemed to be in decent condition. A small, handwritten note was tucked into the box. A unique perspective. Use it wisely. No signature, no return address. Miles shrugged. He was a practical man. He wasn't going to dismiss a potentially useful tool, regardless of its mysterious origins. He decided to test it out. He found a roll of film tucked inside the box with the camera. It was still in a factory-sealed wrapper. He loaded the film, the mechanism clicking and whirring with a satisfying precision. He spent the rest of the day working on a surveillance case, documenting the movements of a suspected insurance scammer. He used his regular digital camera for the majority of the shots, but he also took a few pictures with the Voigtlander just to see if it worked. He dropped the film off at a local photo lab, a small, family-run business owned by an elderly man named Arthur. Arthur had been developing film for decades, and Miles trusted his expertise. When he returned to pick up the prints, Arthur greeted him with a curious expression. "These are interesting," he said, his voice hesitant. "There's some anomalies in a few of the shots." Miles frowned. "Anomalies?" Arthur handed him the envelope of prints. "Take a look. I'm not sure what to make of them." Miles stepped outside, sat in his car, and opened the envelope. The first few photos were unremarkable, standard surveillance shots of the subject entering and leaving a building. But then he saw it. In one of the photos, a shadowy figure was visible in the background, lurking near a parked car. It was blurry, indistinct, but undeniably there. It looked human-shaped, but distorted, elongated, as if it were made of smoke or shadow. Miles felt a prickle of unease. He examined the photo closely. It wasn't a double exposure. It wasn't a light leak. It was something else, something he couldn't explain. He looked at the other photos. More shadowy figures appeared in several of them, always in the background, always slightly out of focus. They were different shapes, different sizes, but they all shared the same unsettling quality, the same sense of being not quite real. He went back inside the lab. "Arthur," he said, "did you notice anything unusual about these negatives?" Arthur shook his head. The negatives looked clean. No scratches, no fogging, nothing out of the ordinary. It's just these figures. I've never seen anything like it. Miles thanked him, took the photos, and left, his mind racing. He was a rational man, a man of logic. He didn't believe in ghosts or ghouls or things that went bump in the night. But he couldn't deny what he was seeing. The photos were evidence, tangible proof of something. He decided to investigate. He went back to the location where he'd taken the photos, his digital camera in hand. He took the same shots from the same angles at the same time of day. The digital photos were perfectly normal. No shadowy figures, no distortions, no anomalies. He spent the next few days experimenting with the Voigtlander, taking pictures in different locations at different times of day, under different lighting conditions. And every time the shadowy figures appeared, sometimes they were faint, almost invisible. Other times, they were more distinct, more disturbing. They never appeared in the same place twice. They seemed to move, to shift, to follow him. And they always seemed to be watching. Miles felt a growing sense of unease, a creeping dread that he couldn't shake. He was a man of logic, but logic couldn't explain what was happening. He was starting to question his own sanity, his own perception of reality. He decided that perhaps he needed a second, third, and fourth opinion on his evidence. He knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. Miles decided he needed to show the photographs to someone he trusted, someone who wouldn't immediately dismiss him as crazy. He thought of his friend, Sarah, a forensic analyst who worked for the police department. She was sharp, analytical, and had a keen eye for detail. He called Sarah and arranged to meet her at a local diner. He brought the photos, both the ones taken with the Voigtlander and the ones taken with his digital camera, as well as the antique camera itself. He laid the photos out on the table, explaining the situation, the mysterious camera, the shadowy figures. Sarah listened intently, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern as she examined the images. "These are disturbing, Miles," she said finally. "I can't explain them. It's not a double exposure, not a light leak, not any kind of technical malfunction I've ever seen." She picked up the Voigtlander, turning it over in her hands. "Where did you say you got this?" "I don't know," Miles admitted. "It just appeared on my desk." Sarah frowned. "That's odd. Have you tried to trace it? See if there's a serial number or anything?" Miles shook his head. "There's a label on the bottom, but it's mostly peeled off. I can only make out a few letters and numbers." Sarah examined the label closely. "It looks like M. Blackwood Photography," she said, squinting. "And a partial serial number, maybe 18. I can't read the rest." "M. Blackwood," Miles repeated. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. Sarah handed the camera back to him. "I don't know what to tell you, Miles," she said. "This is outside my area of expertise. But I can tell you one thing. These photos are not normal. There's something wrong with them." Her words sent a shiver down Miles's spine. He knew she was right. He knew there was something wrong with the camera, something wrong with the photos, something wrong with the shadowy figures that lurked within them. He thanked Sarah, gathered the photos and the camera, and left the diner, feeling more unsettled than ever. He decided to do some research on M. Blackwood Photography. He spent hours searching online databases, old city directories, historical archives. He found a few references to a photographer named Marcus Blackwood, who had operated a studio in the city in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But there was nothing about him, nothing about his work that suggested anything unusual. He found an old newspaper article mentioning a fire at Blackwood's studio, a fire that had claimed the photographer's life. The article described Blackwood as a recluse and an eccentric, a man who had been obsessed with capturing the unseen world on film. Miles felt a chill run down his spine. The unseen world. Was that what he was seeing in the photos? Was that what the shadowy figures were? He decided to visit the site of Blackwood's former studio. It was now a vacant lot, a patch of overgrown weeds and crumbling concrete in a rundown part of the city. He stood there, staring at the empty space, trying to imagine the studio that had once stood there, the man who had worked within its walls, the camera that had captured something beyond the realm of normal perception. He felt a sudden urge to take another picture. He loaded a fresh roll of film into the Voigtlander, raised it to his eye, and pressed the shutter button. He waited, his heart pounding, his hands trembling. He took another picture, and another, and another. He finished the roll, his mind racing, his senses on high alert. He rushed back to Arthur's photo lab, his anxiety growing with each passing minute. He handed Arthur the roll of film, his voice barely a whisper. "Please," he said, "develop these, quickly." Arthur nodded, sensing the urgency in Miles's voice. He disappeared into the darkroom, and Miles waited, pacing nervously, his eyes fixed on the closed door. Finally, Arthur emerged, his expression grim. He handed Miles a stack of wet prints. "Miles," he said, his voice low, "you need to see this." Miles grabbed the photos and stared at them, his blood turning to ice. The shadowy figures were there, of course, but they were different now. They were closer, more distinct, more menacing. And in the last photo, one of the figures was standing right behind him. It was tall, gaunt, its face obscured by a dark hood, its long skeletal fingers reaching out towards him. Miles felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He dropped the photos, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He stumbled back, his mind reeling. He knew with a chilling certainty that the camera wasn't just capturing images. It was capturing something else, something dark, something dangerous, and it was getting closer. Miles backed away from the photos scattered on the counter, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Arthur watched him, concern etched on his face. "Miles, what's going on?" Arthur asked, his voice gentle. "What are these things?" Miles couldn't answer. He couldn't find the words to explain the terror that was gripping him. He shook his head, unable to meet Arthur's gaze. He turned and fled the lab, leaving the photos behind. He ran to his car, fumbled with the keys, and started the engine. He drove aimlessly, his mind racing, his heart pounding. He didn't know where to go, what to do. He felt like he was losing his grip on reality, like he was being pulled into a nightmare from which he couldn't escape. He thought about the camera, the shadowy figures, the feeling of being watched. He thought about Marcus Blackwood, the reclusive photographer who had been obsessed with capturing the unseen world. He realized, with a chilling certainty, that he had stumbled onto something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. He had opened a door to a realm beyond his understanding, a realm of darkness and shadows. He decided he had to get rid of the camera. He couldn't keep it, couldn't risk taking another picture. He had to destroy it, to sever the connection to whatever dark force it contained. He drove to a remote area, a deserted stretch of highway near the outskirts of the city. He pulled over, grabbed the camera from the passenger seat, and got out of the car. The night was dark, moonless. The only light came from the stars and the distant glow of the city skyline. He held the camera in his hands, feeling its weight, its coldness. He hesitated. A part of him, the logical, rational part, told him it was just a camera, an inanimate object. But another part, the part that had seen the photos, that had felt the presence of the shadowy figures, knew better. He raised the camera above his head, intending to smash it against the pavement. But he couldn't. He couldn't bring himself to destroy it. It was as if something was holding him back, some unseen force preventing him from breaking the connection. He lowered the camera, his hands trembling. He tried again, but the same thing happened. He couldn't do it. He realized, with a growing sense of despair, that he was trapped. The camera had a hold on him, a power over him. He couldn't get rid of it, couldn't escape it. He got back in his car, defeated. He drove back to his apartment, the camera sitting on the passenger seat like a silent, menacing companion. He spent the rest of the night in a state of near constant fear. He kept the lights on, he checked the locks on the doors and windows. He jumped at every creak and groan of the old building. He didn't sleep. He sat in his armchair, staring at the camera, waiting for something to happen. As dawn approached, he heard a faint sound, a scratching, scraping noise, coming from the direction of the camera. He looked at the camera. It was sitting on his coffee table, seemingly inert, but the scratching continued, growing louder, more insistent. He leaned closer, his heart pounding. He saw it then, the lens. It was moving, slowly, almost imperceptibly. It was turning, rotating, as if it were focusing on something or someone. He watched, paralyzed with fear, as the lens continued to turn. And then he saw it, a reflection, in the lens. It wasn't his reflection. It was the shadowy figure, the tall, gaunt figure with the hooded face and the long, skeletal fingers. It was inside the camera, and it was looking at him. Miles screamed, a long, primal scream of terror that echoed through the empty apartment. He scrambled back, knocking over his chair, falling to the floor. The camera fell to the floor with a thud. The lens shattered, and the shadowy figure vanished. Miles lay on the floor, gasping for breath, his body shaking uncontrollably. He slowly got to his feet, his eyes fixed on the broken camera. The lens was shattered, the glass fragments scattered across the floor. The camera was ruined, destroyed, but the shadowy figure was gone. Miles felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed by a profound sense of exhaustion. He had broken the connection. He had escaped. He spent the next few days cleaning up the mess, throwing away the broken camera, trying to forget what had happened. But he couldn't. The image of the shadowy figure, the feeling of being watched, the terror of those sleepless nights, remained etched in his memory. He never took another picture. He abandoned his career as a private investigator, unable to face the possibility of encountering something like that again. He moved to a different city, started a new life, tried to leave the past behind. But he knew deep down that he would never truly be free. He would always carry the memory of the lens of shadows, the camera that had shown him a glimpse of a world beyond human understanding, a world of darkness and fear. And he would always wonder what those shadowy figures were and where they had gone. He threw the camera away, picked up the pieces, and tried to forget. The Apartment of Apparitions, a descent into urban horror. This story isn't about ghosts, at least not in the traditional sense. It's about something far more disturbing, the darkness that can reside within the human heart, and the unsettling ways in which that darkness can manifest in the most unexpected of places. It's a story about a descent into a nightmarish reality, a blurring of the lines between the living and the dead, and a confrontation with an evil so profound it left an indelible mark on my soul. My friends and I, a motley crew of newly minted adults, were in a phase of reckless exploration. We were fascinated by the abandoned, the forgotten, the remnants of a world that had once been. We sought out derelict buildings, crumbling factories, and neglected structures, drawn by a morbid curiosity and a youthful desire to push boundaries, to test the limits of our courage. We were, in essence, urban explorers, though we lacked the sophistication and the equipment of those who truly dedicate themselves to that pursuit. We were simply a group of friends, fueled by cheap beer and a naive sense of invincibility. We lived in a relatively unremarkable suburban area of Australia, a place not known for its architectural wonders or its historical significance. Finding truly exciting, unexplored locations was a challenge. So, you can imagine our collective excitement when we stumbled upon rumors of an abandoned apartment complex in the heart of the city. It was a whispered legend, a tale passed down through the grapevine of local lore, a place shrouded in mystery and rumored to be haunted. We decided to investigate, of course. It was a spontaneous decision, fueled by alcohol and the thrill of the unknown. We were planning to hit a nightclub later that evening, so by the time we arrived at the apartment complex, most of us were already well into a state of intoxication. Looking back, I cringe at the sheer stupidity of our actions, the reckless disregard for our own safety. But at the time, we were young, foolish, and convinced that nothing bad could ever happen to us. The building itself was an imposing structure, a hulking monolith of concrete and glass that loomed over the surrounding streets. It was a U-shaped design, approximately 20 stories tall, its facade marred by graffiti and the telltale signs of neglect. A high fence, topped with barbed wire, encircled the perimeter, a clear indication that this was not a place meant for casual visitors. One of my friends, Katie, volunteered to act as a lookout, remaining outside the fence to alert us to the presence of security guards or any other unwelcome visitors. The rest of us are Don, a powerfully built young man who often assumed the role of our de facto leader. Connor, a fellow enthusiast of urban exploration, always eager for a new adventure. And 3 other girls, Beth, Jill, and Brooke, who were primarily interested in the nightclub but had reluctantly agreed to accompany us on this preliminary excursion, prepared to breach the perimeter. With a mixture of awkward scrambling and whispered encouragement, we managed to scale the fence, dropping down onto the overgrown grounds of the abandoned complex. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of damp concrete and neglected vegetation. The silence, broken only by the distant hum of city traffic, was unsettling, a stark contrast to the boisterous energy of our group. Dawn, ever the fearless leader, took the initiative, pushing open a heavy metal door that led to one of the building's stairwells. The interior was shrouded in darkness, the air thick with dust and the musty odor of stagnant water. We fumbled for our phones, using their weak beams of light to illuminate our surroundings. We began our ascent, our footsteps echoing through the silent stairwell. The building seemed to breathe around us, its empty corridors and vacant apartments whispering tales of lives lived and abruptly abandoned. We explored each floor, cautiously opening doors, peering into rooms that were, for the most part, eerily similar. Remnants of former occupants littered the floors and surfaces. Broken plates, discarded furniture, stained carpets, and the occasional personal item that hinted at the lives that had once unfolded within these walls. As we climbed higher, we discovered that the stairwells were strangely blocked off at certain points, forcing us to navigate a labyrinthine path through the building, moving from one stairwell to another in a frustratingly inefficient manner. It added to the sense of disorientation, of being lost in a concrete maze, a feeling that was amplified by the alcohol coursing through our veins. By the time we reached the 15th floor, I, fueled by a mixture of boredom and drunken bravado, decided to engage in a particularly foolish act. I spotted a sliding glass door leading to what I assumed was a balcony, and, for reasons that now escape me, decided to attempt to kick it in. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated stupidity, a testament to the impaired judgment that comes with excessive alcohol consumption. My attempt, predictably, was pathetic. My foot connected with the glass, producing a loud thud but failing to make any significant impact. I was immediately scolded by my friends, their voices hushed but laced with a mixture of annoyance and concern. The noise, they pointed out, could attract unwanted attention, jeopardizing our entire ill-conceived adventure. I laughed it off, attempting to downplay my foolishness, but the incident had a sobering effect. It was a reminder of the potential dangers of our situation, of the precariousness of our position. It was in the midst of this awkward silence, this moment of self-reproach, that Jill, one of the girls who had been reluctant to join us in the first place, suddenly froze. Her face, normally animated and expressive, turned pale, her eyes widening with alarm. "Did any of you hear that noise?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I think there's someone above us." Her words sent a jolt of adrenaline through the group. Beth and Brooke, already on edge, immediately expressed their desire to leave, their voices rising in panic. But Don, ever the intrepid explorer, had a different reaction. "Then let's go," he said, his voice surprisingly calm, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Hurry." He brushed past us, heading towards the stairs leading to the floor above, his movements swift and decisive. We didn't have time to argue, to debate the wisdom of his decision. We were forced to follow, our own fears and anxieties momentarily overridden by the need to keep the group together, to ensure that Dawn didn't venture into the unknown alone. We ascended the stairs, our footsteps muffled, our breaths held tight in our chests. The silence of the building seemed to press in on us, amplifying every creak, every rustle, every whispered word. We reached the next floor, the 15th, and began to cautiously explore the hallway, Don leading the way, peering through doorways and windows, his senses on high alert. We were about halfway down the corridor when we heard it. A thud, a heavy, resonant sound emanating from one of the rooms directly beside us. It was a sound that sent a chill down my spine, a sound that spoke of something wrong. Don froze, his body rigid, his eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and apprehension. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that Jill hadn't been imagining things. There was someone or something in that room. Jill, Beth, and Brooke, their fear now palpable, retreated to the far end of the hallway, their whispers a frantic plea to abandon our exploration, to flee this unsettling place. But Dawn, Connor, and I, driven by a morbid curiosity, a need to understand the source of the unsettling sound, remained. We knew with a chilling certainty that we had to see what was behind that door. Don, his face now pale but resolute, approached the door. He reached for the knob, his hand trembling slightly, and with a deep breath, turned it. The door creaked open, revealing the darkness within. I raised my phone, its beam of light cutting through the gloom, illuminating the interior of the room. And that's when we saw him, an older man, his face gaunt and weathered. His hair a tangled mess of gray, stood in the center of the room. He was wearing tattered clothing, his skin marked by cuts and bruises. But it was his right arm that caught our attention. It was covered in blood, crimson streaks running down his forearm, dripping onto the stained carpet below. In his hand, he held a reflective object, a shard of glass or perhaps a crudely fashioned knife, its surface glinting menacingly in the beam of my phone. And his face was twisted into a grotesque, unsettling smile, a caricature of human expression that sent a wave of pure, unadulterated terror through me. The scene was like something out of a horror movie, a tableau of violence and depravity that seemed utterly incongruous with the mundane reality of our lives. The air was thick with the coppery tang of blood, the silence broken only by the man's ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of our hearts. I don't know how long we stood there, frozen in place, staring at this horrific scene. It could have been seconds, it could have been minutes. Time seemed to lose all meaning, suspended in a moment of pure, unadulterated terror. Then, Don and Connor, seemingly jolted back to reality by some primal instinct for survival, turned and fled. My body finally responding to the overwhelming urge to escape, followed close behind. We didn't speak. We didn't look back. We just ran, our footsteps echoing through the silent corridors, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. We scrambled down the stairs, our movements clumsy and desperate, nearly tripping over ourselves in our haste to escape. We burst out of the building, into the relative safety of the night, our lungs burning, our hearts pounding. We were quickly detained by the security guards, alerted by the noise of our frantic escape. They saw the terror etched on our faces, the raw, visceral fear that radiated from our very beings. We stammered out an explanation, our words jumbled, incoherent, a desperate attempt to convey the horror we had just witnessed. The police were called. They arrived swiftly, their sirens screaming through the night, their presence a stark contrast to the eerie silence of the abandoned building. We watched, our bodies trembling, as they entered the complex, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, their voices echoing through the empty corridors. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged, escorting the man we had seen in the room. He was handcuffed, his head bowed, his body slumped in defeat. But as he passed us, he looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and that same crooked, unsettling smile spread across his face. It was a smile that spoke of madness, of depravity, of a darkness that I could scarcely comprehend. One of the officers, a young woman with a weary expression, approached us. "It's a good thing you got away from there," she said, her voice low and serious. His intentions were clearly awful. Her words, though understated, confirmed our worst fears. We had stumbled upon something truly evil, something that defied rational explanation. We had narrowly escaped a situation that could have had catastrophic consequences. We didn't go to the nightclub that night. The desire for revelry, for escape, had been replaced by a profound sense of unease, a lingering fear that clung to us like a shroud. The next morning, I awoke to a flurry of messages on our group chat. Connor had sent a link to a news article published just hours earlier. The headline sent a chill down my spine. Homeless man murdered in abandoned apartment complex. The article described the discovery of a body, a homeless man who had been brutally murdered, his body found in the very same building we had explored just hours before. The details were gruesome, the violence unspeakable. And then I remembered the blood, the copious amounts of blood that had stained the carpet, that had covered the man's arm, that had glistened on the makeshift weapon he held in his hand. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. We had stumbled upon a crime scene, a place where a horrific act of violence had just been committed. We had seen the killer face to face and had narrowly escaped becoming his next victims. Since that night, 2 years ago, we have not returned to any abandoned places. The thrill of exploration, the allure of the unknown, has been replaced by a deep-seated fear, a profound respect for the potential dangers that lurk in the shadows. The memory of that night, of the man's face, of the blood, of the chilling smile, remains vividly etched in my mind, a constant reminder of the darkness that can reside within the human heart, and the unsettling ways in which that darkness can manifest in the most unexpected of places. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to the bone, that I will never, ever forget the night we stumbled upon the apartment of apparitions, the night we came face to face with an evil that defied comprehension. The Unshowered Samaritan, a Florida encounter. Florida. The name itself conjures up a kaleidoscope of images. Sun-drenched beaches, swaying palm trees, alligators basking in murky swamps, and, of course, the infamous Florida Man. The latter, a ubiquitous meme, a symbol of the state's seemingly endless supply of bizarre, often unbelievable news stories. I, having grown up in Escambia County, a region nestled in the panhandle of this often maligned state, can attest to the fact that, while the Florida Man stereotype is often exaggerated for comedic effect, there is a kernel of truth to the underlying notion that Florida, perhaps more than any other state, seems to attract a disproportionate share of eccentricity. This particular story, a personal anecdote that still makes me shake my head in disbelief, unfolded on a seemingly ordinary evening. I was living with my parents, a typical family arrangement in a state where multi-generational households are not uncommon. We were gathered in the living room, engaged in the quintessential American pastime, watching television. The flickering images on the screen, the canned laughter of a sitcom, the comforting familiarity of a shared routine. It was all a stark contrast to the chaotic events that were about to unfold just outside our front door. The first sign that something was amiss came in the form of raised voices. Shouting, at first muffled and indistinct, gradually grew louder, more insistent, intruding upon the manufactured reality of our television program. My mother, ever the pragmatist, initially dismissed it as the usual neighborhood drama, a minor squabble between neighbors that would likely resolve itself without any significant intervention. "Noisy neighbors again," she muttered, shaking her head in a gesture of weary resignation. We continued to watch the show, attempting to ignore the escalating commotion outside. But the shouting intensified, accompanied by a new, unsettling sound, the revving of an engine. It was a sound that spoke of aggression, of potential violence, a sound that pierced the veil of our domestic tranquility and demanded our attention. My mother, her initial nonchalance replaced by a growing concern, reached for the remote control, lowering the volume of the television. We strained our ears, trying to decipher the words being exchanged, to piece together the narrative of this unfolding drama. The shouting, we realized, was coming from directly outside our house. It was close, immediate, a palpable presence that could no longer be ignored. I got up, my curiosity piqued, my senses on high alert, and cautiously approached the curtains that covered the window overlooking the street. I peered through a narrow gap, my eyes scanning the scene unfolding before me, and what I saw was surreal. In the middle of the street, illuminated by the harsh glare of a streetlight, was a young man, clad only in his underwear, facing off against a large pickup truck. He was shouting, his voice hoarse with anger, his body language defiant. The driver of the truck, a larger, older man, was leaning out of the window, shouting back, his face contorted with rage. It was a scene straight out of a movie, a bizarre confrontation that seemed utterly incongruous with the quiet, residential street where we lived. From what I could gather, from the snippets of conversation I could overhear, the argument centered around the young man's refusal to do something the truck driver, his father, was demanding. The exact nature of this demand remained unclear, at least initially, shrouded in the heated exchange of insults and accusations. The argument escalated, reaching a fever pitch of intensity. The two figures, the young man in his underwear and the older man in his truck, were screaming at each other, their voices raw with emotion, their words laced with a venomous hostility. It was a scene of escalating conflict, a powder keg of familial tension about to explode. And then it happened. The driver, seemingly consumed by a blind rage, leaned back into his truck, revved the engine, and, in a move that defied all logic and reason, attempted to run the young man over. It was an act of such reckless, wanton violence that it took my breath away. I gasped, my body recoiling in horror, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was witnessing. Luckily, the young man, despite his state of undress and his apparent emotional distress, reacted with surprising agility. He dodged the oncoming truck, leaping out of its path with a desperate scramble, and fled into the front yard of one of our neighbors, his bare feet pounding against the grass. My mother, who had joined me at the window, gasped audibly. "Oh my gosh!" she exclaimed, her voice filled with a mixture of shock and disbelief. We watched, our hearts pounding in our chests, as the truck screeched to a halt, executed a clumsy U-turn in the middle of the street, and prepared to make another pass at the young man. It was a scene of escalating madness, a display of unchecked aggression that seemed utterly detached from reality. But the young man was not about to become a victim. He sprinted across several yards, his movements fueled by adrenaline and a primal instinct for survival, and headed straight for our house. He began banging on our front door, his fists pounding against the wood, his voice screaming for help. We didn't hesitate. We reacted instinctively, driven by a shared sense of compassion, a need to offer sanctuary to this terrified, half-naked stranger. We flung open the door, pulling the young man inside, and slammed it shut, just as the truck roared past again, the driver's angry shouts echoing through the night. My mother, ever the practical one, immediately ran to call the police, her voice trembling as she reported the incident. I, meanwhile, was left to deal with the immediate aftermath. A distraught, nearly naked teenager standing in our living room, his body trembling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I tried to comfort him, to offer words of reassurance, but the situation was awkward, to say the least. He was in his underwear, and I, a young woman myself, was in no mood to be hugging a half-naked stranger, no matter how panicked he might be. It was a situation that defied all social norms, a moment of bizarre intimacy forced upon us by the sheer absurdity of the circumstances. While we waited for the police to arrive, the young man's father, the driver of the truck, began banging on our front door, his voice booming through the house, demanding that his son come out and face the music. It was a scene of escalating chaos, a domestic dispute playing out in our living room, a bizarre intrusion of the outside world into our normally quiet, predictable lives. Trying to ignore the commotion, I remember asking the young man, in a desperate attempt to make sense of the situation, what had transpired to cause such an intense family argument. What could possibly have led to a father attempting to run over his own son in the middle of the street? And his answer was so utterly, unbelievably bizarre that it still makes me shake my head in disbelief. He told me, straight-faced, without a hint of irony or embarrassment, that his father was furious because he refused to take a bath. He ranted about how he was a grown man, capable of making his own decisions, and that he wouldn't be told what to do, especially when it came to matters of personal hygiene. It was at that moment, as he stood there, ranting about his right to refuse basic hygiene, that I began to notice the smell. It was a pungent, overpowering odor, a combination of sweat, dirt, and something else. It was the smell of someone who hadn't bathed in quite some time. His skin, I noticed, was greasy, his hair unkempt, his breath unpleasant. While I could never condone the father's actions, his attempt to run over his son with a truck, I began to understand on some level the source of his frustration. This was not a simple disagreement. It was a clash of wills, a battle over basic hygiene, a conflict that had escalated to a level of absurdity that defied all reason. My mother, returning from her call to the police, had a similar reaction. She attempted to reason with the young man, to offer words of comfort and support. But as he continued to rant about his right to refuse a bath, her expression shifted, her nostrils flaring slightly as she, too, became aware of the aroma. There was a moment of silence, a pause in the conversation, as my mother and I exchanged a look of shared disbelief. We were both, at that moment, utterly speechless, overwhelmed by the sheer absurdity of the situation. Eventually, the police arrived. They found the father still banging on our door, screaming profanities, his face red with rage. He engaged in a heated argument with the officers, his words slurred, his movements uncoordinated. It quickly became apparent that he was intoxicated, a factor that undoubtedly contributed to his reckless, violent behavior. The officers attempted to reason with him, to de-escalate the situation, but he remained belligerent, defiant, his anger fueled by alcohol and a deep-seated sense of entitlement. The confrontation escalated, culminating in the officers wrestling the man to the ground, handcuffing him, and placing him under arrest. We, meanwhile, recounted the events of the evening to the police, emphasizing the father's attempt to run over his son with the truck. It was a detail that could not be ignored, a clear indication of attempted murder, regardless of the underlying cause of the dispute. The officers, understandably concerned, asked the father if he had, in fact, tried to run his son over, and his response, slurred and defiant, confirmed our account. "He's my son," he declared. "I'll raise him how I want. If he doesn't do what I tell him, I'ma whip him." It was a statement that sealed his fate. He had admitted, in his drunken stupor, to attempting to harm his son. The officers, their expressions grim, placed him in the back of their patrol car and drove him away, leaving us to grapple with the aftermath of this bizarre, unsettling encounter. The whole situation was, without a doubt, one of the craziest things that has ever happened to me. It was a Florida man's story come to life, a testament to the state's reputation for attracting the unusual, the eccentric, the downright bizarre. Since moving away for college, I've come to appreciate the relative normalcy of other parts of the country. Sure, there are crazy people everywhere, but the concentration of crazies in Florida, as evidenced by this particular incident, seems to be significantly higher. I'm grateful that the situation was resolved without any serious injuries, that the young man, despite his questionable hygiene habits, escaped unharmed. And I'm grateful that I no longer live in a place where encounters like this are, sadly, not entirely uncommon. It was a night that reinforced the importance of basic hygiene, the dangers of unchecked anger, and the sheer, unadulterated strangeness of life in the Sunshine State. And perhaps most importantly, that sometimes a nice-smelling, clean person is much better than a smelly, dirty one, regardless of age. The unsolved mystery of Sewell Street, Beryl Atherton's cold case. The year 1950 casts a long, somber shadow over the quaint, coastal town of Marblehead, Massachusetts. It was a year marked by a brutal, unsolved crime, a murder that shattered the tranquility of this historic community and left a lingering stain on its collective memory. The victim was Beryl Atherton, a 47-year-old elementary school teacher, a woman described as quiet, reserved, and deeply private. Her life, seemingly unremarkable, ended in a scene of unimaginable violence, a tragedy that remains shrouded in mystery and speculation to this day. Marblehead, a town steeped in maritime history, is known for its picturesque harbor, its colonial-era architecture, and its close proximity to Salem, a city forever linked to the infamous witch trials of the 17th century. In 1950, Marblehead was a close-knit community, a place where neighbors knew each other, where doors were often left unlocked, and where the pace of life moved at a slower, more deliberate rhythm. It was a world far removed from the bustling metropolises of the 20th century, a place where the echoes of the past seemed to linger in the salty air. Beryl Atherton, a lifelong resident of Marblehead, was a fixture in the local elementary school, having dedicated 25 years of her life to educating the town's children. She was, by all accounts, a dedicated teacher, respected by her colleagues and well-liked by her students. But outside of the classroom, Beryl was a solitary figure, a self-described spinster who lived a quiet, uneventful life. She had no close friends, no immediate family, her only companion a small, white Spitz dog named Esky, a loyal and devoted creature who rarely left her side. Beryl's life revolved around simple routines. She taught school, cared for Esky, and occasionally ventured out to the movie theater in the neighboring town of Lynn, always alone, a solitary figure in the darkened auditorium. She kept a diary, a meticulous record of her daily activities, her thoughts, her feelings. This diary, discovered after her death, would provide a glimpse into the private world of a woman who, on the surface, seemed to live a life of quiet desperation. The weekend of Thanksgiving 1950 was marked by a ferocious nor'easter, a brutal winter storm that battered the Massachusetts coastline with relentless force. The wind howled, the snow piled up in drifts, and the temperatures plummeted, transforming the picturesque town of Marblehead into a frozen, isolated landscape. Beryl Atherton, like many of her neighbors, prepared for the impending storm with a sense of quiet resignation. She ran her final errands, stocking up on essential supplies, ensuring that she and Esky would be comfortable and safe during the long, dark hours of the blizzard. She made a trip to the local grocery store, purchasing a few extra cans of dog food for Esky, a small act of kindness that would, tragically, be one of her last. Around 6 p.m., on that Saturday evening, as the storm began to intensify, Beryl took out a few bags of garbage, a mundane chore that would, in a cruel twist of fate, place her in the path of her killer. As she stood outside her modest clapboard cottage on Sewell Street, she spotted a young neighbor boy watching her from a window of his home. She offered him a wave, a simple gesture of neighborly acknowledgement, a fleeting moment of human connection that would, unknowingly, become her final farewell. This wave, this seemingly insignificant interaction, was the last confirmed sighting of Beryl Atherton alive. The storm raged throughout the weekend, blanketing Marblehead in a thick layer of snow, isolating the town from the outside world. It wasn't until Monday, November 27th, when the snow finally began to subside and the town slowly dug itself out, that the horror of what had transpired on Sewell Street was revealed. The town's milkman, a man known simply as Pint, was making his rounds, delivering milk to the residents of Marblehead. He was a familiar figure in the community, a man who knew his customers well, who understood their routines, their habits, their vulnerabilities. He arrived at Beryl Atherton's cottage, expecting to find her, as usual, waiting for her delivery. But there was no answer when he knocked. He knocked again, louder this time, his concern growing with each passing moment. He knew that Beryl was a frail woman, barely 100 pounds, and he worried about her well-being after such a severe storm. On a hunch, he tried the door handle. It was unlocked. He entered the cottage, his footsteps echoing through the silent, empty rooms. He called out Beryl's name, his voice tinged with apprehension, but there was no response. The air was thick with a sense of unease, a palpable feeling that something was terribly wrong. He walked slowly through the house, his eyes scanning the familiar surroundings, searching for any sign of Beryl. He reached the kitchen, and that's when he saw it. The scene that greeted him was one of unimaginable horror. Beryl Atherton lay on the floor, face up, her body surrounded by a pool of her own blood, now clotted and dark. Esky, her faithful companion, lay nearby, whimpering in pain, his body bearing the marks of the killer's brutal attack. Pint screamed, a primal, guttural sound that shattered the silence of the cottage. He fled the house, his mind reeling, his body trembling, and ran to the home of one of Beryl's neighbors, desperately pleading with them to call the police. The arrival of the police marked the beginning of an investigation that would, ultimately lead nowhere. They surveyed the scene, their faces grim, their movements deliberate. They determined that Beryl Atherton had been dead for days, her body cold and stiff, a testament to the brutal efficiency of her killer. On the kitchen table, they found her brown paper grocery bags, still full of the supplies she had purchased on that fateful Saturday evening. It was a chilling reminder of the normalcy of her final hours, of the mundane routine that had been shattered by an act of unspeakable violence. The medical examiner's report painted a gruesome picture of Beryl's final moments. She had suffered several broken ribs, a testament to the force of the blows she had received. There were bruises around her throat, indicating that she had been strangled so violently that the killer's fingernail imprints were still visible on her skin. And then, the final brutal act. Her throat had been slashed with a small blade, a wound that had severed her jugular vein, ensuring a swift and bloody death. The crime scene, despite the brutality of the attack, was eerily devoid of clues. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication that the killer had struggled to gain access to the cottage. There were no fingerprints, no footprints, no trace evidence that might point to the identity of the perpetrator. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a scene of unimaginable horror and a trail of unanswered questions. The lack of evidence led investigators to theorize that the killer had been meticulous, deliberate, taking the time to clean up the scene, to erase any trace of their presence. The fact that the murder had taken place in Beryl's kitchen, a place where cleaning supplies were readily available, only added to this chilling possibility. Police questioned Beryl's neighbors, searching for any clue, any detail that might shed light on the identity of her killer. But no one had seen or heard anything unusual. The storm, with its howling winds and blinding snow, had effectively masked any sounds of struggle, any cries for help that Beryl might have uttered. Beryl's diary, discovered in her bedroom, offered a glimpse into her private world, revealing a life of quiet solitude, of unfulfilled desires, of a broken love affair that had left her deeply disappointed. But the diary, while providing a window into her emotional state, offered no concrete leads, no tangible evidence that might point to a suspect. The town of Marblehead, once a place of quiet tranquility, was now gripped by fear and suspicion. Rumors swirled, gossip spread like wildfire. Some whispered that Beryl had been leading a double life, that she had become entangled with organized crime figures from Boston, that her murder was a result of some shadowy underworld connection. Others speculated about a jilted lover, a man driven to violence by rejection and despair. Still others pointed to a possible relative, someone who stood to gain financially from Beryl's death. But the reality was far more mundane and far more tragic. Beryl Atherton's estate consisted of a mere $25,000, a paltry sum that hardly seemed worth killing for. There was no evidence of any missing jewelry or other valuables, suggesting that robbery had not been the motive. The investigation stalled, the leads dried up, and the case grew cold. Beryl Atherton's murder became another unsolved mystery, another tragic reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most seemingly peaceful communities. And so, the mystery of Sewell Street remains. The killer, whoever he or she may be, has never been brought to justice. Beryl Atherton's voice, silenced forever by an act of unspeakable violence, continues to echo through the annals of Marblehead's history, a haunting reminder of a crime that remains unsolved, a wound that refuses to heal. And the whispers of the past, the rumors and speculations, continue to circulate, a testament to the enduring power of fear, of uncertainty, and of the human need to find answers, even when those answers may forever remain elusive. The chilling possibility remains that her killer, now likely advanced in age, may still walk free, a ghost haunting the streets of Marblehead, carrying the burden of a secret that may never be revealed. The happiest place, the darkest day, terror on Thunder Mountain. Disneyland. The name alone conjures up images of childhood dreams, of fantastical adventures, of a world where magic is real and anything is possible. For me, Alexander, Growing up in San Diego, California, it was more than just a theme park. It was a refuge, a place of escape, a symbol of joy and innocence. My family, being a military family, moved around frequently, but Disneyland was a constant, a familiar touchstone in a life often characterized by change and uncertainty. My father, a career Marine, served his country with unwavering dedication, eventually reaching the rank of gunnery sergeant before his retirement in 2011. I admired him, I respected him, but I won't pretend that growing up in a military household was easy. His deployments were frequent and prolonged, leaving a void in our family, a constant undercurrent of anxiety that permeated our lives. And when he was home, he was a strict disciplinarian, a man who believed in order, structure, and a firm hand. I often felt stifled, restricted, yearning for the freedom and spontaneity that seemed to come so easily to my civilian friends. But those restrictions, those limitations also served a purpose. They kept me grounded, focused, disciplined. They instilled in me a sense of responsibility, a drive to succeed that would ultimately pave the way for my acceptance into a prestigious university. So, in a way, my father's military career, while a source of both pride and pain, shaped me into the person I am today. The worst part, undoubtedly, was the war. When my father was deployed to Iraq in June of 2003, I was 11 years old enough to understand the gravity of the situation, old enough to comprehend the very real possibility that he might not come home. It was a period of intense emotional turmoil, a time of constant worry and fear. Saying goodbye to him at the airport, knowing that it might be the last time I ever saw him, was one of the most difficult experiences of my young life. The ensuing months were a blur of anxiety and uncertainty. Every news report, every mention of casualties, every image of the war-torn landscape of Iraq sent a jolt of fear through me. I would lie awake at night, my mind racing, imagining the worst possible scenarios. My mother, bless her heart, tried her best to shield me from the harsh realities of the conflict, to maintain a semblance of normalcy in our lives. But I was a perceptive child, sensitive and inquisitive, and I could sense the underlying tension, the unspoken fear that permeated our home. In September of 2003, my mother, in an attempt to distract me from my worries, to provide a temporary escape from the constant anxiety, decided to take me to Disneyland for the weekend. It was a gesture of love, of desperation, a valiant effort to bring a spark of joy back into my life. And for a while, it worked. Disneyland, with its vibrant colors, its whimsical characters, its atmosphere of pure, unadulterated fantasy, was exactly what I needed. I immersed myself in the magic, losing myself in the stories, the rides, the sheer spectacle of it all. I posed for pictures with Mickey Mouse, with Goofy, with all the iconic characters that had populated my childhood dreams. Each ride, each attraction, seemed to alleviate the weight of my anxieties, to transport me to a world where war and worry did not exist. The first day was a resounding success, a much-needed respite from the darkness that had enveloped my life. We explored Adventureland, braved the pirates of the Caribbean, and soared through the skies on Peter Pan's flight. Each experience was a balm for my wounded spirit, a reminder of the joy and innocence that still existed in the world. But then came Big Thunder Mountain Railroad. It was late in the day, around 11:30 p.m., when we finally joined the queue for this iconic roller coaster. The line snaked through a meticulously crafted landscape designed to evoke the rugged beauty of the American Southwest. We passed by faux rock formations, cacti, and the remnants of a deserted mining town, all bathed in the warm glow of strategically placed lighting. The anticipation built as we approached the loading platform. The rhythmic clatter of the train cars, the excited screams of the passengers, the rush of wind, it all created a sense of exhilarating anticipation. We boarded the train, settling into the small, somewhat cramped rail cars. The safety bar was lowered, securing us in place, and with a lurch, we were off. The initial moments of the ride were exhilarating. We sped along the track, twisting and turning through the fabricated landscape, the wind whipping through our hair, the screams of our fellow passengers adding to the sense of chaotic fun. We climbed a steep incline, passing by a simulated desert scene, complete with animatronic animals and the remnants of an abandoned mine shaft. Then we entered the tunnel. It was a moment of darkness, of anticipation, of heightened senses. The air grew cooler. The sounds of the outside world faded, replaced by the rhythmic clatter of the train wheels on the track. And then it happened. A sudden, violent jolt shook the rail cars, throwing us against the safety bars. It was followed by a horrific, grinding sound, the screech of metal against metal, a sound that would forever be etched in my memory. Then, a thud, heavy and resonant, followed by the screams of the passengers in the cars ahead of us. The train came to an abrupt, jarring stop. We were plunged into near-total darkness, the only illumination coming from the faint openings of the tunnel at either end. The air was thick with the smell of dust and something else, something metallic, something acrid. Chaos erupted. People were screaming, crying, calling out for loved ones. The rail cars were no longer aligned, some of them tilted precariously off the track. And the cars in front of us, they were wet, glistening, covered in a dark, viscous fluid. It was blood. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Someone was seriously injured. Someone was dying. I heard a woman's voice, piercing the darkness, a desperate, agonizing cry. "Mark! Mark! Mark! Wake up! Wake up, Mark!" Her voice was filled with a raw, primal grief, a sound that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was the sound of a mother, a wife, a loved one, facing the unthinkable, the unimaginable. In the moments that followed, people began to clamber out of the rail cars, their movements frantic, desperate. They stumbled through the darkness, calling out for help, their voices echoing through the tunnel. "Someone's really badly hurt up there," they cried. "We need help. We need help as soon as possible." As my mother and I managed to extricate ourselves from our rail car, we began to make our way towards the front of the train, towards the source of the screams, towards the scene of the unfolding tragedy. And that's when we saw it. The front car of the train, the locomotive, had derailed. It had jumped the track, and the rear of the car had mounted the car behind it, crushing it, trapping the passengers within. It was a scene of utter devastation, a mangled mess of metal and flesh. The people in the cars ahead of us, those who had been fortunate enough to avoid the direct impact, were trapped, pinned by the wreckage, unable to escape. It was a horrific sight, a testament to the sheer, unforgiving power of physics, of momentum, of a seemingly harmless amusement park ride turned deadly. It took what felt like an eternity for firefighters to arrive, for them to use their specialized equipment to extricate the trapped passengers, to allow paramedics to assess their injuries, to begin the grim task of triage. My mother and I, thankfully, were uninjured, physically at least. We were among the lucky ones, the ones who had been able to walk away from the wreckage. But the emotional scars, the trauma of witnessing such a horrific event, would linger for years to come. We were herded, along with the other uninjured passengers, towards the River Bell Terrace, a nearby restaurant that had been hastily transformed into a makeshift medical treatment area. We were given blankets, water, and offered counseling services. But all I could think about was the woman screaming for Mark, the woman whose life had been irrevocably shattered in a matter of seconds. Later, we learned the grim truth. A man, a passenger in the first car, had died of his injuries. He had been crushed by the weight of the derailed locomotive. His life extinguished in a place that was supposed to be filled with joy, with laughter, with the magic of childhood dreams. It was a tragedy, a senseless, preventable tragedy that cast a long, dark shadow over the happiest place on earth. And it was a tragedy that would forever alter my perception of theme parks, of roller coasters, of the illusion of safety that we so readily embrace. In the aftermath of the accident, I developed a profound fear of roller coasters, of theme parks in general. The sounds, the smells, the sights, they all triggered a visceral, overwhelming anxiety. A reminder of that horrific day on Big Thunder Mountain Railroad. Even the sound of people screaming, the joyous, exuberant screams of thrill seekers would send a shiver of fear down my spine, transporting me back to that darkened tunnel, to the sound of the woman's agonizing cries. I know rationally that theme parks are generally safe, that accidents like the one I witnessed are rare, statistically insignificant, but the fear remains, a primal, instinctive response to a trauma that has been deeply etched into my psyche. And so I avoid them. I avoid the roller coasters, the thrill rides, the manufactured excitement. I prefer the quiet, the predictable, the safe, because I know with a certainty that chills me to the bone that even in the happiest place on earth, darkness can lurk, tragedy can strike, and lives can be shattered in an instant. The memory of that day, of the screams, of the blood, of the woman's desperate pleas, will forever serve as a stark reminder of the fragility of life, of the illusion of safety, and of the darkness that can lie hidden beneath the surface of even the most seemingly joyful of places. The highway of lost hours. Daniel Carter was a long-haul truck driver, accustomed to the solitude of the open road. He'd driven countless miles, crisscrossing the country, delivering goods, and meeting deadlines. He was a man of routine, comfortable with the predictable rhythm of his journeys. But one particular night, on a desolate stretch of highway, his routine shattered, replaced by a disorienting, unsettling experience that defied all logic. Started like any other night run. Daniel was driving his usual route, a long, straight highway that cut through a sparsely populated region. The sky was clear, the stars bright, and the moon a sliver in the inky blackness. He had a delivery scheduled for the next morning, and he was making good time. He had his CB radio on, scanning for chatter, but the airwaves were mostly silent. He sipped his lukewarm coffee, the caffeine a familiar companion on these long hauls. He listened to the steady hum of his engine, the rhythmic thrum of the tires on the asphalt. Around 2 a.m., he noticed something odd. A lone, dead tree on the side of the road. It was tall and skeletal, its branches twisted and gnarled, like the limbs of some ancient, petrified creature. It stood out against the flat, featureless landscape. Daniel glanced at it as he passed, a fleeting moment of observation. He drove on, the miles unfolding beneath his wheels. He checked his mirrors, adjusted his seat, took another sip of coffee, and then he saw it again. The same tree, the same twisted branches, the same skeletal silhouette. He frowned. He'd been driving for at least half an hour. He should have been miles past that tree. He slowed down, his mind racing. Had he somehow turned around? Had he missed a turnoff? He checked his GPS. It showed him still on the same highway, heading in the right direction. He checked his fuel gauge. It showed a little over half a tank, which seemed wrong. He should have used more fuel by now. He felt a prickle of unease. Something wasn't right. He accelerated, wanting to put some distance between himself and that unsettling tree. He drove for another 20 minutes, his eyes scanning the road ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. And then he saw it, a crooked road sign, leaning at an unnatural angle, its surface covered in faded graffiti. He'd seen that sign before. He was sure of it. The graffiti was identical, the same scrawled letters, the same faded colors. His heart began to pound. He was going in circles, or something else was happening, something he couldn't explain. He stopped the truck, his breath catching in his throat. He looked around, his eyes straining to penetrate the darkness. The highway stretched out before him, empty and silent. He checked his mirrors. Nothing, just the blackness of the night. He got out of the truck, the cold air hitting his face. He walked around, checking the tires, the engine, anything that might explain what was happening. Everything seemed normal. He got back in the truck, his mind racing. He tried to call his dispatcher, but his phone had no signal. He tried the CB radio, but he only got static. He felt a growing sense of isolation, of being cut off from the world. He was alone on a highway that seemed to be playing tricks on him. He was losing time. He decided to keep driving. He had to keep moving, had to find an exit, a town, anything. He drove for what felt like hours, but the landscape remained unchanged. The same dead tree, the same crooked sign, the same empty highway. It was like he was trapped in a loop, a recurring nightmare. He started to hear things, faint whispers carried on the wind. He couldn't make out the words, but they sounded close. He rolled down his window, listening. The whispers seemed to surround him, swirling around the truck, taunting him. He rolled up the window, his hands shaking. He turned on the radio, hoping for some distraction, but he only got static. The static seemed to respond to the whispers, crackling and hissing in a strange rhythmic pattern. He turned off the radio, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was losing his grip, his sense of reality. He felt like he was being toyed with, like something was watching him, manipulating him. He saw another landmark, one he'd seen several times before. A fallen utility pole, lying on the side of the road, its wires tangled and broken. He knew with a chilling certainty that he was going to see it again, and again, and again. He slammed his fist on the dashboard, a surge of anger and frustration coursing through him. He had to break the cycle, had to find a way out, but he didn't know how. He kept driving, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his mind racing, his body tense. The highway stretched out before him, an endless ribbon of asphalt, leading him nowhere. He was trapped, lost in a maze of repeating landmarks and unsettling whispers, and he knew with a growing sense of dread that he might never escape. The highway seemed endless, a loop of asphalt and dread. He had to find a way out. Daniel fought to maintain his composure. He focused on his breathing, trying to slow his racing heart. He knew panic would only make things worse. He had to think, to find a way to break this cycle. He decided to try a different approach. He wouldn't stop, wouldn't react to the whispers, wouldn't let the repeating landmarks get to him. He would just drive steadily, consistently until something changed. He set his cruise control, maintaining a constant speed. He kept his eyes on the road, ignoring the periphery, ignoring the whispers, ignoring the growing sense of dread. He drove for what felt like hours. The clock on his dashboard ticked forward, but the landscape remained the same. The dead tree, the crooked sign, the fallen utility pole. They appeared again and again, like markers in a twisted, surreal game. But Daniel didn't react. He didn't slow down, didn't speed up, didn't swerve. He just kept driving, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He started to notice something. The whispers, though still present, seemed to be fading. They were less insistent, less intrusive. The static on the radio, though still there, seemed to be less responsive. He felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he was breaking through. Maybe by refusing to react, by refusing to give in to the fear, he was weakening whatever force was holding him captive. He kept driving. The highway stretched out before him, still empty, still silent, but somehow less menacing. The darkness seemed less oppressive, the air less cold. He saw the dead tree again. He braced himself, expecting the usual surge of dread, but it didn't come. He just felt numb. He drove past it, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He saw the crooked sign. He didn't react. He just kept driving. He saw the fallen utility pole. He didn't flinch. He just kept driving. And then he saw something different. A light, a faint, distant light on the horizon. His heart leaped. He accelerated, his foot pressing down on the gas pedal. The light grew brighter, closer. It was a town, a small town with streetlights and houses and signs of life. He drove towards it, his eyes fixed on the light, his hope surging. He was breaking free. He was escaping. He reached the town limits and the highway changed. The repeating landmarks vanished. The whispers faded away. The static on the radio cleared. He pulled into a gas station, his hands shaking, his body exhausted. He got out of the truck, his legs stiff and achy. He looked around, taking in the sights and sounds of the town. It was a normal town, a quiet town, a town that felt real. He went inside the gas station, bought a coffee, and sat down at a small table. He sipped the coffee, feeling the warmth spread through his body. He felt safe. He didn't know what had happened on that highway. He didn't know what force had held him captive, or why it had let him go. But he knew one thing: he would never drive that road again. He finished his coffee, paid for it, and got back in his truck. He drove away from the town, away from the highway, away from the nightmare. He drove until he reached a major city, a place filled with noise and light and people. He parked his truck, got out, and took a deep breath. He was free. He abandoned his delivery, abandoned his truck, abandoned his old life. He started over, found a new job, a new home, a new routine. But he never forgot the highway of lost hours. He never forgot the dead tree, the crooked sign, the fallen utility pole, the whispers, and he never drove alone at night again. The memory of the repeating landmarks, the endless loop, the whispers that seemed to penetrate his very thoughts, these remained, a chilling testament to a night he could neither explain nor forget. The open road, once a symbol of freedom, now held a different meaning, a reminder of the time he lost and the terror he found on that lonely stretch of asphalt. The highway remained, a silent, watchful entity, waiting for its next traveler. The persistence of TikTok. Bartholomew Bart Higgins was a man defined by order. His life was a symphony of punctuality, a meticulously crafted schedule where every minute had its designated purpose. He checked his vintage pocket watch, a gift from his grandfather, precisely every hour, even on weekends. His apartment was a testament to his regimented existence. Everything in its place, every surface gleaming, every object aligned with geometric precision. So, when he decided to acquire a grandfather clock at an estate auction, it wasn't for aesthetic reasons. It was for the reinforcement of his structured world. He found the clock at a small, local auction house. It wasn't the most ornate piece. It lacked the intricate carvings and gilded embellishments of some of the other items. It was a simple, understated clock, with a plain wooden case, a clean, unadorned face, and a pendulum that swung with a quiet, steady rhythm. The glass covering the face had a network of fine scratches, evidence of its age, but Bart found them charming, a testament to its enduring functionality. The auctioneer provided scant details. Early 20th century origin, maker unknown. Bart didn't care about its history. He cared about its precision. He placed a modest bid, won the clock without much competition, and transported it back to his apartment that same afternoon. He positioned the clock in his living room, against a wall that received ample natural light. He carefully leveled it, ensuring it stood perfectly upright. He gently nudged the pendulum, setting it in motion. The clock began to tick, a deep, resonant sound that filled the room. Tick-tock, tick-tock, a steady, reassuring pulse. Bart felt a sense of satisfaction. The clock was a perfect addition to his meticulously ordered world. He noted the exact time he'd started the pendulum, intending to track its accuracy against his pocket watch. He was a man of comparisons, of quantifiable data. That evening, he observed the clock closely. The pendulum's swing was remarkably consistent, showing no signs of slowing down. Most clocks, especially older ones, required occasional winding or adjustments. This one seemed to defy the natural tendency towards entropy. He went to bed at his usual time, 10:30 p.m. sharp. He lay in bed, listening to the rhythmic tick-tock of the clock, which seemed to permeate the walls of his apartment. It was a comforting sound, at first a symbol of order and predictability. But as the minutes ticked by, it began to feel intrusive. He got out of bed, closed the living room door, and returned to his bed. The ticking was muffled, but still audible. He tried to ignore it, to focus on his breathing, on the quiet hum of the city outside. But the clock's persistent rhythm had burrowed its way into his consciousness. The next morning, Sunday, he woke up at his usual time, 6:17 a.m. He went into the living room, expecting to find the clock still ticking, still keeping perfect time. And it was. The pendulum swung with the same unwavering rhythm. The hands aligned precisely with the time on his pocket watch. He felt a flicker of something, Not quite unease, but a subtle disturbance in his otherwise placid emotional landscape. It was the clock's perfection that bothered him, its unnatural resistance to any deviation. He tried to wind the clock, even though it didn't need it. The winding key turned, but he felt a resistance, as if the internal mechanism were already fully wound, taut and unyielding. He tried to stop the pendulum, holding it firmly in his hand. The ticking stopped. He held his breath, listening. Then, he released the pendulum. It didn't start swinging immediately. For a split second, it remained motionless. Then, it began to move slowly at first, a tiny, almost imperceptible oscillation. Then, it gained momentum, swinging wider and wider, until it reached its original, full arc. The ticking resumed, steady and relentless. Bart felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He backed away from the clock, his heart beating a little faster. He told himself it was just a well-made machine, a testament to superior craftsmanship. But a nagging doubt had taken root. He spent the rest of the day trying to ignore the clock, but its presence dominated the apartment. He found himself constantly glancing towards the living room door, listening for any change in its rhythm. There was none. The tick-tock was unwavering, a constant, metronomic pulse. That evening, the unsettling feeling intensified. He was on a phone call with his sister, a typically mundane conversation about family matters. As he spoke, he felt his anxiety rising, a sense of being rushed, of being pressured. And he noticed something else. The ticking of the clock seemed to be faster. He walked into the living room, still holding the phone to his ear, and stared at the pendulum. It was definitely swinging more rapidly than before. He checked his pocket watch. The clock was still keeping accurate time, but the intervals between the ticks had shortened. He tried to explain it to his sister, but she dismissed it as his imagination. He ended the call abruptly, his mind racing. He timed the pendulum swing against his pocket watch, counting the seconds. It was subtle but undeniable. The clock was ticking faster. Then, as he watched, it slowed down again, returning to its original rhythm. He felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. He was losing his grip, his sense of order, his control. He decided to try an experiment. He would deliberately alter his own heart rate and see if the clock responded. He did some jumping jacks, getting his pulse racing. He stood in front of the clock, breathing heavily, his heart pounding. The pendulum swung faster. He sat down, closed his eyes, and focused on slowing his breathing, on calming his mind. The pendulum slowed down. Bart felt a cold terror grip him. The clock wasn't just keeping time. It was connected to him, somehow, to his own internal rhythm. It was mirroring his heartbeat, his anxiety, his fear. He had to get rid of it. He had to break the connection. But how? Bart knew he couldn't spend another night in the apartment with the clock. The rhythmic ticking, now inextricably linked to his own heartbeat, was driving him to the edge of madness. He had to get it out, tonight. He tried to lift the clock, to carry it out to the hallway, but it was heavier than he expected. It felt rooted to the floor, as if some invisible force were holding it in place. He strained, his muscles bulging, but the clock wouldn't budge. He tried to dismantle it, to remove the pendulum, the weights, the internal mechanism. He found a small screwdriver in his toolbox and started unscrewing the back panel. The screws were old and rusty, and they resisted his efforts. He finally managed to remove them, but when he tried to lift the panel, it wouldn't come off. It was as if it were glued in place. He felt a surge of frustration and fear. He was trapped, a prisoner in his own apartment, held captive by a clock that seemed to have a life of its own. He decided to try a different approach. He would cover it, muffle the sound, block it from his sight. He grabbed a thick, heavy blanket from his bedroom and draped it over the clock, completely obscuring it. The ticking continued, muffled but still audible. He could feel it, vibrating through the floor, through the walls, through his very bones. He retreated to his bedroom, closed the door, and turned on the television, trying to drown out the sound. He flipped through the channels, finding nothing that could hold his attention. He felt a growing sense of desperation, of being overwhelmed by the relentless, inescapable rhythm of the clock. He tried to sleep, but it was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the pendulum swinging, heard the tick-tock echoing in his mind. He felt his own heartbeat, synchronized with the clock, a constant reminder of the unnatural connection. He got out of bed, his body aching with exhaustion. He walked to the window and looked out at the city below. The streets were quiet, the buildings dark, the world asleep. He felt utterly alone, isolated in his own private nightmare. He decided to try one last thing. He would destroy the clock. He didn't care about the consequences, about the damage to his apartment, about the potential cost. He just had to stop the ticking. He went to the kitchen, grabbed a hammer from his toolbox, and walked back into the living room. He stood in front of the blanket-covered clock, his heart pounding, his hands trembling. He ripped the blanket off, revealing the clock in all its unsettling glory. The pendulum was swinging, the hands were moving, the ticking was relentless. He raised the hammer above his head and brought it down with all his might. The hammer struck the glass face of the clock, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. But the pendulum kept swinging. The hands kept moving. The ticking continued. He struck again and again and again, smashing the wooden case, splintering the internal mechanism, reducing the clock to a pile of rubble. But the pendulum kept swinging. It was lying on the floor, detached from the rest of the clock, but it was still moving, back and forth in a slow, steady rhythm. And the ticking continued. Bart stared at the wreckage, his body shaking, his mind numb with disbelief. He had destroyed the clock, but he hadn't stopped it. The ticking was coming from everywhere. It was in the walls, in the floor, in the air. It was inside him. He sank to his knees, defeated. He closed his eyes and listened to the relentless tick-tock, the sound of his own heartbeat, the sound of his own unraveling. He was no longer in control. The clock had won. He began to rock back and forth, matching the rhythm of the never-stopping pendulum. He started to hum, then speak, matching the tick and the tock. He knew as he descended that it was the only thing he could do now. The noise, at last, provided some comfort. He ticked, he tocked. The unseen watcher, a night of suburban terror. This story, this fragment of my past, is something I've tried to compartmentalize, to relegate to the dusty archives of forgotten memories. It's a memory shrouded in fear, in uncertainty, in the chilling realization that sometimes the most terrifying threats are the ones we can't see, the ones that lurk just beyond the periphery of our awareness. It happened when I was around 8 years old, a time when the world still held a certain innocence, a time before the harsh realities of adulthood had fully intruded upon my consciousness. My mother and I were living in a small 2-room apartment in El Paso, Texas. It was a modest dwelling, but it was our home, a sanctuary from the sprawling, often overwhelming, city that surrounded us. My mother, a single parent, worked tirelessly to provide for us, often taking on graveyard shifts at a local truck stop to make ends meet. She trusted me, perhaps more than she should have, to take care of myself during those long, lonely nights. She would leave me with a set of instructions, simple rules designed to ensure my safety and well-being. Do your dishes, go to bed at a reasonable hour, and, most importantly, don't open the door for strangers. This particular night, like many others, began with a sense of quiet solitude. My mother, after planting a gentle kiss on my forehead, had departed for her shift, leaving me alone in the dimly lit apartment. I had been engrossed in an episode of SpongeBob SquarePants, the animated antics of the underwater characters providing a welcome distraction from the silence of the empty apartment. It was late, far past my usual bedtime, a small act of rebellion against the rules, a fleeting taste of the freedom that came with being unsupervised. I hadn't done my dishes. I hadn't followed my mother's instructions. I was, in essence, a typical 8-year-old, testing the boundaries, indulging in the small pleasures of disobedience. I decided, finally, to heed my mother's advice, at least partially. I turned off the television, the flickering images fading to black, and headed towards my bedroom, the promise of sleep beckoning. I remember distinctly reaching for a book, Alice in Wonderland, a classic tale of fantasy and adventure that I often used as an escape from the mundane realities of my life. I read for a while, losing myself in the whimsical world of talking animals and mad tea parties, until eventually exhaustion overcame me and I drifted off to sleep. The awakening was abrupt, disorienting. I found myself lying in bed, my eyes wide open, my mind struggling to make sense of my surroundings. My book lay on the floor, its pages splayed open, a testament to my sudden, unexpected return to consciousness. My nightlight, a small, comforting beacon in the darkness, cast a soft, yellow glow across the room. I was confused. What had woken me? Had I heard a noise? Had I had a bad dream? Couldn't recall. I decided, with a surge of youthful bravery, to investigate. I got out of bed, my bare feet padding softly against the carpeted floor, and began to explore the apartment. I checked the living room, the kitchen, the small bathroom, searching for any sign of disturbance, any indication of what might have disrupted my slumber. And then, I noticed it. The front door was unlocked. It was a small detail, easily overlooked, but it sent a jolt of unease through me. I had a vague recollection of locking it earlier, of ensuring that the deadbolt was securely in place. Had I forgotten? Had I imagined locking it? I approached the door, my heart beating faster, my senses on high alert. I reached for the lock, intending to secure it, to restore the sense of safety that had been subtly, yet profoundly disrupted. But as I reached for the knob, I felt it, a resistance. It was as if someone, on the other side of the door, was holding the knob, preventing me from turning it, from engaging the lock. It was a subtle pressure, a barely perceptible force, but it was unmistakable. My heart leaped into my throat. My breath caught in my chest. I knew with a chilling certainty that I was not alone. I could hear it, breathing, heavy, labored breathing, coming from just beyond the door. It was not my own. It was the breathing of someone else, someone unseen, someone lurking in the shadows of the night. Panic seized me. I pushed against the door, using all my strength, trying to force it closed, to lock it, to shut out the unseen presence that threatened to intrude upon my sanctuary. But the resistance remained, a silent, unwavering force that held the door firmly in place. And then I heard it, laughter, a low, guttural chuckle, emanating from the other side of the door. It was a sound that sent shivers down my spine, a sound that spoke of malice, of mockery, of a darkness that I could scarcely comprehend. The laughter, at first a quiet rumble, grew louder, more insistent, punctuated by words, unintelligible at first, then gradually coalescing into a menacing, incomprehensible murmur. I couldn't make out the exact words, but the tone was unmistakable. Sharp, angry, threatening. I was terrified. My body trembled. Tears welled up in my eyes, and a scream, a desperate, primal cry for help, built in my throat. I wanted to call out, to alert my neighbors, to summon help, but the fear, the sheer, overwhelming terror paralyzed me. "I'm calling the cops." I managed to stammer out, my voice choked with emotion, my words barely audible above the pounding of my heart. The laughter continued, undeterred by my desperate threat, but the resistance against the door ceased. I seized the opportunity, quickly turning the lock, securing the deadbolt, and stepping back, my body trembling, my eyes fixed on the door, expecting it to burst open at any moment. I ran to my room, my bare feet slapping against the carpet, and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. I grabbed my phone, a small, clunky device that seemed woefully inadequate in the face of this unfolding nightmare, and dialed my mother's number. Through tears, through sobs, through gasps for air, I recounted the events of the past few minutes, my words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. My mother, her voice calm and reassuring, tried to soothe me, to offer words of comfort, to promise that she was on her way. "It'll be okay. she said, her voice a lifeline in the storm of my terror. "I'm coming home. Just stay in your room. Don't open the door for anyone." And then I heard it, tapping, a light, rhythmic tapping coming from my bedroom window. It was a sound that sent a fresh wave of terror through me, a sound that shattered any lingering hope that this was all just a figment of my imagination. The laughter returned, echoing through the apartment, mocking my fear, taunting my helplessness. I cried louder, my voice a desperate plea, begging my mother to hurry, to save me from this unseen tormentor. The details of the next few minutes are hazy, blurred by the intensity of the fear, by the sheer, overwhelming terror that consumed me. I remember hiding under my blanket, a childish attempt to shield myself from the unseen threat, my body trembling uncontrollably. I don't remember when the tapping stopped. I don't remember when the laughter faded. I only remember the overwhelming relief, the profound sense of gratitude, when my mother finally burst through the door, her face etched with concern, her arms reaching out to embrace me. We called the police, of course. They arrived, surveyed the scene, questioned me, searched the apartment and the surrounding area, but they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no evidence of an intruder, no explanation for the unsettling events that had transpired. They suggested it might have been a prank, a cruel joke played by some neighborhood kids. But I knew with a certainty that defied logic that it was something more, something darker. We moved, shortly after that night, relocating to a second-story apartment, a place where the windows were further from the ground, a place where I felt at least marginally safer. But the memory of that night, of the unseen watcher, of the laughter, of the tapping, lingered, a constant reminder of the vulnerability of our existence, of the darkness that can lurk just beyond the periphery of our awareness. It was a night that shattered my innocence, a night that forced me to confront the reality that the world was not always a safe, predictable place, that sometimes the most terrifying threats are the ones we can't see, the ones that whisper in the shadows, waiting to pounce. The babysitter's terror, an echo of unseen laughter. This story, this chilling recollection, is one I've revisited countless times in my mind, turning it over and over, examining it from every angle, searching for a rational explanation, a logical loophole that might dispel the lingering unease it evokes. It's a story about shared fear, about the blurring of reality and imagination, and about a sound, a specific, unsettling sound that would haunt my childhood and, for a time, the childhood of a friend. I was 6 or 7 years old, a small, impressionable child, still navigating the complexities of the world, still clinging to the vestiges of innocence that would soon be shattered by the harsh realities of life. My father, a man whose presence in my life was often defined by his absence, had arranged for a babysitter to look after me. This was a common occurrence, a consequence of my parents' fractured relationship, a situation that often left me feeling isolated and vulnerable. The babysitter, a 16-year-old neighbor named Sarah, was a familiar figure, a girl I looked up to, a teenager who seemed to embody the cool, carefree spirit of adolescence. We were in my father's trailer, a modest dwelling that served as our temporary home, a place that held both familiar comforts and a lingering sense of unease. The evening began uneventfully. We settled in the living room, a space dominated by a large, sectional sofa and a television set that flickered with the predictable images of cable programming. A bar, a raised counter, separated the living room from the kitchen, partially obscuring the view of the latter. Sarah, occupying one end of the sofa, was engrossed in a magazine, her attention seemingly focused on the glossy pages. Nestled on the floor near the television, was content to play with my toys, my imagination transforming the mundane surroundings into a world of adventure and fantasy. The dog, a small, fluffy creature whose name escapes me now, was asleep between us on the floor, a silent, comforting presence in the otherwise empty trailer. It was a bright, moonlit night, the celestial glow filtering through the windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. It was the kind of light that made everything seem slightly off, slightly unreal, I awoke abruptly, jolted from a dreamless sleep by a surge of adrenaline, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea what had awakened me, what had triggered this sudden, visceral response. I sat up, my eyes scanning the dimly lit room, searching for any sign of disturbance, any indication of what had disrupted my slumber. It was around 2 a.m., I estimated, judging by the quality of the light, the stillness of the night. It was the hour when the world seemed to hold its breath, when the veil between reality and the unknown seemed to thin, when the whispers of the subconscious could easily be mistaken for the voices of something else. And then I heard it, a laugh, a chilling, unsettling laugh, emanating from the kitchen. It was a sound that defied easy description, a sound that seemed to exist outside the realm of normal human experience. It was not the sound of a person laughing, not a genuine expression of mirth or amusement. It was mechanical, in a way, high-pitched yet strangely flat, devoid of any warmth or humanity. It was like the sound a toy might make, a broken, malfunctioning toy, its voice box warped and distorted. The laughter was repetitive, looping, each burst consisting of 3 distinct sounds, each iteration lasting for varying lengths of time. Sometimes it would be short, abrupt, a staccato burst of unsettling noise. Other times it would be drawn out, elongated, a chilling, drawn-out expression of something. Something I couldn't quite define, something that sent shivers down my spine. It was almost like my mother's laugh, yet twisted, mangled into something not quite human. I was frozen with fear, my body rigid, my mind racing. I knew instinctively that this was not a normal sound, that this was not something that belonged in the realm of the ordinary. It was a sound that spoke of something other, something that lurked just beyond the periphery of my understanding. I leaped onto Sarah, my small body colliding with hers, my knee accidentally ramming into her side. It was a desperate, instinctive act, a plea for comfort, for protection, for reassurance. She woke with a startled gasp, her eyes wide with confusion. "Ow!" she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep, her tone more annoyed than alarmed. She tried to soothe me, to calm me, to tell me to go back to sleep, unaware of the terror that gripped me. I tried to speak, to explain, to convey the urgency of the situation, but my words were choked, fragmented, lost in the rising tide of my fear. "There's a sound," I stammered, my voice trembling. "In the kitchen. It's not normal." And then she heard it, the laughter, that chilling, repetitive, mechanical laughter, echoed through the trailer once more. Sarah's face, moments before clouded with sleep, transformed. Her eyes widened, her body tensed, and a look of sheer, unadulterated terror washed over her. The confusion, the annoyance vanished, replaced by a primal fear that mirrored my own. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible above the pounding of my heart. "Yes," she replied, her voice equally hushed, her body trembling. We clung to each other, 2 frightened children huddling together in the face of an unknown, unseen threat. I buried my face in her shoulder, trying to shut out the sound, to escape the terror that gripped me. I looked at her, my eyes wide with panic. "I'm afraid," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. "I know," she replied, her voice trembling. "I am too." She tried to get up, to investigate, to confront the source of the unsettling sound. She told me she was going to check outside, to see if perhaps some friends were playing a prank, trying to scare us. But I clung to her, my small hands gripping her arm with a desperate strength, begging her not to leave me, not to abandon me to the unseen horror that lurked in the kitchen. She relented, her own fear seemingly overriding her initial impulse to act. She told me to stay put, to remain on the couch, while she cautiously made her way to the front door. The laughter continued, its repetitive, mechanical cadence a constant reminder of the unseen presence that haunted the trailer. Sarah peered through the peephole, scanned the surrounding area, but saw nothing. She ventured outside, circling the trailer, her eyes darting nervously, searching for any sign of an intruder, any explanation for the chilling sound. I, meanwhile, remained on the couch, my body shaking uncontrollably, my skin covered in goosebumps, my mind racing with 1,000 terrifying possibilities. I glanced at the dog, our supposed protector, and saw that he, too, was terrified. He was wide-eyed, his body trembling, his gaze fixed on the kitchen, his ears perked, his posture a clear indication of his alarm. He, like us, sensed the presence of something unnatural. Sarah returned, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She had seen nothing, found nothing. There was no one outside, no sign of any disturbance, no explanation for the chilling laughter that continued to echo through the trailer. The laughter persisted, its intervals gradually decreasing, until finally, it ceased altogether. The silence that followed was almost as unsettling as the sound itself. A void filled with unspoken fear, with the lingering presence of something unseen, something unknown. We huddled together on the couch, clinging to each other for comfort, avoiding the kitchen, avoiding the darkness, until eventually exhaustion overcame us and we drifted off into a fitful, uneasy sleep. The next day, my father was informed of the events of the previous night. He searched the trailer, meticulously examining every room, every closet, every nook and cranny, searching for any sign of a toy, a device, anything that might explain the source of the mechanical laughter. But he found nothing. There was no explanation.
No logical.
Rational reason for what we had heard, for what we had experienced. The dog, a creature of instinct, had sensed it too, had shared our fear, had cowered in terror alongside us. Sarah, understandably shaken by the experience, never babysat for me again. The memory of that night, of the unseen laughter, of the shared terror, was too much for her to bear, and I was left with a lingering sense of unease, a fear of the unknown, a fear of the darkness that lurked just beyond the periphery of my awareness. It was a fear that would stay with me, a constant reminder of that night in my father's trailer, when the veil between reality and the inexplicable seemed to thin, revealing a glimpse of something truly terrifying. The experience, inexplicable and unsettling, left a mark, a haunting reminder of the unseen forces that might, or might not, exist in the world around us. It raised questions that I could not answer, questions that defied logic, questions that tapped into the deepest, most primal fears of childhood. And it left me with a chilling certainty that sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones we cannot see, the ones we cannot explain, the ones that whisper in the shadows, just beyond the reach of our understanding. The lingering echo, a second encounter with the unexplained. This story, this second chapter in my personal encounter with the inexplicable, is inextricably linked to the previous one. It's a continuation of the same unsettling theme, a reinforcement of the chilling realization that sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones that defy logic, that resist rational explanation, that linger in the shadows of our minds, refusing to be dismissed as mere coincidence or imagination. As I mentioned before, I was around 6 or 7 years old at the time, a child still grappling with the complexities of the world, still clinging to the vestiges of innocence that would soon be irrevocably shattered by the harsh realities of life. I was being babysat, not by Sarah this time, but by the mother of my childhood friend, a boy named, for the sake of anonymity, let's call him Caleb. Caleb and I were inseparable, two peas in a pod, sharing a bond of friendship that transcended the usual childhood squabbles and rivalries. We spent countless hours together, exploring the neighborhood, building forts in the woods, and engaging in the imaginative games that define the landscape of childhood. This particular babysitting arrangement was not unusual. My father, often absent due to his work and strained relationship with my mother, frequently relied on Caleb's mother to look after me. It was a situation born of necessity, a consequence of the fractured family dynamics that shaped my early years. The evening began like any other. Caleb and I were in the living room of his family's home, a sprawling, comfortable space dominated by a large, sectional sofa, the kind that seemed to swallow you whole, inviting you to sink into its plush embrace. We were on opposite ends of this furniture behemoth, separated by a vast expanse of cushions and blankets, each of us lost in our own world. The room was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from a nearby lamp and the flickering glow of the television, which was likely tuned to some cartoon or children's program, though the specifics escape my memory. The air was thick with the comforting aroma of whatever Caleb's mother was cooking in the kitchen, a scent that evoked a sense of warmth and security. Caleb was positioned near the hallway, a narrow passage that led to the other rooms of the house, the bedrooms, the bathrooms, the spaces where the adults, Caleb's mother and older brother, were presumably asleep, their snores a distant, rhythmic rumble that occasionally punctuated the silence. I, on the other hand, was nestled against the wall on the far side of the living room, as far away from the hallway and from the kitchen as possible. It was a subconscious act of self-preservation, a lingering consequence of the previous terrifying encounter, a desire to distance myself from the source of the unsettling sound that had haunted my dreams. And then we heard it, that same laugh, that chilling, unsettling, mechanical laugh, emanating from the kitchen, from behind the small island that separated it from the living room. It was a sound that instantly transported me back to that night in my father's trailer, a sound that triggered a visceral, overwhelming sense of fear. It was the same repetitive, looping cadence, the same high-pitched yet strangely flat tone, the same unsettling quality that defied easy description. It was the sound of something broken, something not quite human, something that belonged to a realm beyond my comprehension. Caleb and I, our eyes wide with terror, stared at each other across the vast expanse of the sofa. The stuffed animals we clutched in our hands, symbols of childhood comfort and security, suddenly seemed woefully inadequate, offering no protection against the unseen threat that lurked just beyond our view. We were both cocooned in blankets, swaddled in layers of fabric, as if attempting to create a physical barrier between ourselves and the source of the unsettling sound. Our heads were exposed, our eyes darting nervously, scanning the room, searching for any sign of movement, any indication of what was producing that chilling laughter. That's the sound I heard. I whispered, my voice trembling, my words barely audible above the pounding of my heart. Caleb nodded, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. He too recognized the sound, understood the significance of its reappearance. We were both, in that moment, united by a shared terror, a shared understanding that something profoundly unsettling was happening. We whispered to each other, our voices hushed, our words fragmented, a desperate attempt to make sense of the situation, to find some rational explanation for what we were experiencing. "What is it?" Caleb whispered, his voice laced with fear. "I don't know," I replied, my voice equally shaky. "I don't know." We considered our options, limited as they were. We could run, flee the house, seek refuge in the darkness of the night. But where would we go? We were children, alone, vulnerable, and the thought of venturing out into the unknown, into the night, was almost as terrifying as the sound itself. We could wake Caleb's mother, alert her to the unsettling presence in her kitchen. But what if she didn't believe us? What if she dismissed it as a childish prank, as a figment of our overactive imaginations? And so, we arrived at the only conclusion that seemed remotely logical, the only course of action that offered even a semblance of control. We would ignore it. We would close our eyes, pretend we didn't hear it, and hope that, eventually, it would go away. It was a childish, naive strategy, born of desperation and fear. But it was all we had. We closed our eyes, squeezing them shut, as if by doing so we could block out the sound, could erase the reality of what was happening. We held our breath, listening, waiting, our bodies tense, our minds racing. The laughter continued, its repetitive, mechanical cadence a constant reminder of the unseen presence that haunted the house. It seemed to go on forever, each burst of sound a fresh wave of terror washing over us. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. I don't know how, I don't know why, but exhaustion, that relentless force that can overcome even the most intense fear, finally claimed me. I awoke, hours later, to a scene that would forever be etched in my memory, a scene that would fuel my nightmares for years to come. I was lying on the floor, my body contorted into an unnatural position, my back arched, my head thrown back, my limbs twisted and rigid. I was dizzy, disoriented, my vision blurred. I was covered in vomit, the acrid smell stinging my nostrils, the sticky residue clinging to my skin. I had no memory of what had happened, no recollection of how I had ended up on the floor, of how I had vomited, of anything that had transpired between the moment I closed my eyes and the moment I awoke. I tried to move, to sit up, but my body refused to cooperate. My muscles were stiff, aching, as if I had been subjected to some intense physical exertion. My arms and legs were locked in place, my hands clenched into fists, my fingers contorted into unnatural shapes. It was as if I had suffered a seizure, a stroke, some catastrophic neurological event that had left me paralyzed and disoriented. I managed, with considerable effort, to untangle myself, to regain some semblance of control over my body. I sat up, my head spinning, my stomach churning, my mind racing. I looked around the room, searching for any sign of Caleb, any indication of what had happened. He was gone. I called out to Caleb's mother, my voice weak and shaky. She came running, her face etched with concern, her eyes wide with alarm. "Why are you on the floor?" she asked, her voice laced with a mixture of confusion and worry. I tried to explain, to recount the events of the night, but the words wouldn't come. My memory was a blank, a void where the terrifying events of the previous hours should have been. Caleb's mother and brother, both awakened by the commotion, told me a story that defied comprehension, a story that filled me with a chilling sense of dread. They said that I had been screaming, not in words, but in primal, guttural sounds, the kind of screams that emanate from the deepest recesses of terror. They said that I had been babbling, uttering nonsensical phrases, my words jumbled, incoherent, devoid of any meaning. They said that I had been convulsing, my body thrashing violently, my eyes wide open, yet seemingly unseeing. They said that I had vomited, repeatedly, the acrid smell filling the room, the sight of it adding to the horror of the scene. They said that I had gone in and out of consciousness, slipping between moments of lucidity, where I would plead for help, and periods of utter oblivion, where I would scream and thrash and babble incoherently. Caleb, they said, had been terrified. He had witnessed the entire episode, had watched in horror as his friend, his companion, had seemingly lost his mind, had been overtaken by some unseen force. He was so shaken by the experience that he refused to go near me for weeks afterward, his fear a palpable, tangible thing. I, of course, had no memory of any of this. The entire episode was a blank, a void in my consciousness, a missing piece of my personal history. The laughter, that chilling, mechanical laughter, was never heard again. It vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared, leaving behind only a trail of unanswered questions, a lingering sense of unease, and a profound, inexplicable fear. In the years that followed, I delved into the world of psychology, of mental illness, of neurological disorders, searching for a rational explanation, a scientific basis for what I had experienced. I explored the possibilities of seizures, of sleep disorders, of dissociative states, but nothing seemed to fit. Nothing could fully account for the shared experience, for the fact that both Caleb and I had heard the same unsettling sound, had reacted with the same primal fear. The mystery remains. The laughter lingers, an echo in the recesses of my mind, a constant reminder of the unseen forces that may, or may not, exist in the world around us. And I am left with the chilling realization that sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones we cannot explain, the ones that defy logic, the ones that whisper in the shadows, just beyond the reach of our understanding. Two separate people cannot simultaneously experience the exact same auditory or visual hallucination together. It remains a fact that is completely unexplainable. the melodies of Blackwood Manor. Clara Bellwether was a piano tuner, renowned for her meticulous ear and her ability to coax music from even the most neglected instruments. She'd traveled the world, restoring grand pianos in concert halls, uprights in dusty parlors, and everything in between. She prided herself on her professionalism, her ability to diagnose and fix any mechanical problem. But Blackwood Manor presented a challenge unlike any she had encountered before. The manor sat perched on a windswept cliff overlooking the turbulent sea. It was a sprawling, Gothic structure, its stone walls weathered by centuries of storms, its windows like dark, watchful eyes. The locals whispered stories about the place, tales of a tragic past, of a family consumed by madness, of a piano that played itself in the dead of night. Clara, a woman of logic and reason, dismissed these stories as folklore. She'd been contacted by a solicitor representing the current owner, a reclusive descendant of the original Blackwood family. The owner wanted to sell the manor, but the piano, a magnificent Steinway grand, was reportedly unplayable. Clara's task was to assess the instrument and, if possible, restore it to working order. She arrived at Blackwood Manor on a blustery afternoon. The wind howled through the gnarled trees surrounding the property, and the waves crashed against the rocks below with a deafening roar. She parked her van, a sturdy vehicle filled with her tools and equipment, and approached the imposing front door. The door creaked open as she reached for the heavy iron knocker, revealing a cavernous entrance hall. The air inside was cold and damp, carrying the scent of dust and decay. A tall, thin man with a pale complexion and haunted eyes greeted her. He introduced himself as Mr. Grimshaw, the caretaker. "Miss Bellwether," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "We've been expecting you." He led her through a maze of dimly lit corridors, their footsteps echoing on the stone floors. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women, their eyes seeming to follow Clara as she passed. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the creaking of the old house and the distant roar of the sea. They reached a large, high-ceilinged room at the end of a long hallway. The windows, tall and arched, offered a breathtaking view of the stormy ocean. In the center of the room, covered in a thick, dust-laden sheet, stood the Steinway. Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. It wasn't just the cold, or the silence, or the eerie atmosphere of the manor. It was something else, something indefinable, a sense of unease that settled over her like a shroud. Mr. Grimshaw pulled the sheet off the piano, revealing the instrument in all its faded glory. The wood was dark and polished, but it was covered in a layer of dust and grime. The ivory keys were yellowed with age, and a few were chipped or cracked. Clara approached the piano cautiously. She ran her fingers along the keys, feeling the smooth, cool ivory. She pressed a few keys, expecting to hear a muted, out-of-tune sound, but there was nothing. Silence. She pressed harder, playing a chord. Still nothing. She frowned. This was unusual. Even a badly neglected piano should produce some sound. She opened the lid, revealing the intricate mechanism of hammers and strings. Everything looked normal. The strings were intact, the hammers were in place, the dampers were functioning. She pressed a key again, watching the hammer strike the string. It should have vibrated, should have produced a tone, but it didn't. It was as if the piano were absorbing the sound, swallowing it whole. "It hasn't been played in years," Mr. Grimshaw said, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Not since the tragedy." Clara ignored him. She was focused on the piano, on the impossible silence. She pulled out her tuning tools, her mind racing, trying to find a logical explanation. She checked the tuning pins, the soundboard, the bridges. Everything seemed to be in order, at least structurally. She spent hours working on the piano, meticulously examining every component, testing every key, listening for any hint of sound. But there was nothing. The piano remained stubbornly, unnaturally silent. She tried everything she could think of. She adjusted the tension of the strings, she cleaned the hammers, she checked for any obstructions. She even used a small electronic tuner to see if the strings were vibrating at an inaudible frequency. But the tuner registered nothing. The sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the waves crashed against the rocks with a furious intensity. Clara felt a growing sense of frustration, mixed with a creeping sense of dread. She stood up, stretching her aching back, and looked around the room. The only light came from a single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting a harsh, unflattering glow. The silence, broken only by the wind and the sea, was unnerving. And then she heard it, a sound, faint, musical sound. A single note played on the piano. She froze, her heart pounding. She turned slowly, staring at the piano. The keys were still. Nothing moved. She told herself it was her imagination, a trick of the wind, the creaking of the old house. But she knew it wasn't. She had heard a note, clear, distinct note, and it had come from the piano. Clara held her breath, listening intently. The silence returned, broken only by the natural sounds of the storm outside. She waited, her senses on high alert, her body tense. Then she heard it again. Not a single note this time, but a series of notes. A disjointed, atonal melody. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was undeniably there. It was coming from the piano. She approached the instrument slowly, cautiously, her flashlight beam illuminating the keys. They remained motionless. She reached out and touched one of the keys, pressing it down gently. Silence. She played a chord, a simple C major. Silence. She played a scale, arpeggio, a series of random notes. Silence. But the faint, disjointed melody continued, seemingly emanating from the very wood of the piano itself. It was as if the instrument were playing itself, but only when she wasn't touching it. She stepped back, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She had to document this. She grabbed her phone, switched it to video mode, and started recording. She pointed the camera at the piano, capturing the stillness of the keys, the darkness of the room, the eerie silence. She waited, and then the melody began again, faint, hesitant, atonal. But this time, when she played back the recording, there was nothing, only silence. Clara felt a wave of frustration and fear. She was experiencing something real, something tangible, but she couldn't capture it, couldn't prove it. It was as if the piano were deliberately defying her, mocking her attempts to understand it. She decided to try a different approach. She would leave the room, leave the piano alone, and see if it would play on its own. She set up her phone on a tripod, pointing it at the piano, and started recording. She then left the room, closing the door behind her. She stood in the hallway, listening, her heart pounding. She could hear the wind howling, the waves crashing, the creaking of the old house. But she could also hear something else. Music. Faint, ethereal, but definitely music. Coming from the piano room. She waited for several minutes, her body tense, her senses on high alert. Then, she slowly opened the door and stepped back inside. The piano was silent. The keys were still. Nothing had changed. She stopped the recording and played it back. The video showed the piano still and silent for the entire duration. But the audio captured the music. Clear, distinct, undeniably there. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. The piano was playing, but only when she wasn't there. And it was only recording the sound, not the movement of the keys. It was as if the music were coming from somewhere else. She decided to spend the night at the manor. She couldn't leave, not yet. She had to understand what was happening. Mr. Grimshaw showed her to a guest room, a large, sparsely furnished chamber with a four-poster bed and a view of the stormy sea. He gave her a thin blanket and a flickering candle, his eyes avoiding hers. "Sleep well, Miss Bellwether," he said, his voice a low whisper. "If you can." He left, closing the door behind him, and Clara was alone. She sat on the bed, listening to the wind and the waves, and the faint, distant sound of the piano. She didn't sleep. She lay awake, her mind racing, her senses on high alert. She kept expecting to hear the music again, to feel the presence of something unseen in the room. As dawn approached, she heard it. A single, sustained note played on the piano. It echoed through the silent manor, a mournful, haunting sound. She got out of bed, her body stiff and aching. She walked to the window and looked out at the stormy sea. The sky was gray, the waves were wild, the wind was relentless. She knew she couldn't stay at Blackwood Manor any longer. She had to leave, to escape the oppressive atmosphere, the unsettling silence, the impossible music. She packed her tools, gathered her belongings, and went downstairs. She found Mr. Grimshaw in the kitchen, drinking a cup of tea. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice firm. "I can't fix the piano. There's something wrong with it. Something I can't explain." Mr. Grimshaw nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on his tea. "I understand," he said. "Many have tried. None have succeeded." Clara left Blackwood Manor, the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks filling her ears. She drove away, not looking back, the image of the silent piano, the haunting melody, forever etched in her memory. She never returned. She never tuned another piano. The melodies of Blackwood Manor had silenced her own music, forever. The experience had changed her, had shaken her belief in the tangible, in the logical, in the explicable. She had encountered something beyond her understanding, something that defied all reason and science. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that the piano in Blackwood Manor would continue to play its silent, haunting melodies long after she was gone. It was a song from a place she couldn't reach, the Beckoning Cove. Isabel Thorne, a marine biologist with a passion for the unexplored corners of the coastline, had sought refuge in the small, seaside village of Port Blossom. She'd rented a quaint cottage, a weathered structure perched on a bluff overlooking the ocean, seeking solace and a break from the pressures of her research. She craved the quiet solitude, the rhythmic crash of waves, the salty tang of the sea air. Port Blossom was a picturesque village with narrow, winding streets, colorful houses, and a friendly, if somewhat reserved, population. But there was one place the locals avoided, a small, secluded cove hidden behind a jagged outcrop of rocks, known as Whisperwind Cove. They told stories about it, tales whispered in hushed tones in the local pub, of strange lights, unsettling sounds, and a persistent feeling of unease that clung to the place like sea mist. They warned Isabel to stay away, especially after dark. But Isabel was not one to be deterred by local superstitions. She was a scientist, a woman of reason and observation. She was intrigued by the stories, by the challenge of uncovering the truth behind the folklore. She visited Whisperwind Cove during the day, at low tide. It was a small, crescent-shaped beach, the sand a dark, almost black color, contrasting sharply with the lighter sand of the surrounding beaches. The rocks that framed the cove were tall and imposing, casting long shadows across the sand. The air felt different. In the cove, it was colder, heavier, and carried a faint, almost metallic scent that she couldn't quite place. She walked along the shoreline, examining the rocks, the tide pools, the marine life. She found nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that could explain the local legends. But as she was about to leave, she noticed something. Footprints, in the wet sand, near the water's edge. They were large, much larger than human footprints, and deeply impressed in the sand, as if something heavy had walked there. She crouched down, examining them closely. They were vaguely humanoid in shape, with a distinct heel and 5 rounded toes. But they were too wide, too deep, too unnatural. She felt a prickle of unease. She took out her phone and photographed the footprints, her hand trembling slightly. She looked around, scanning the cove, the rocks, the surrounding cliffs. She was alone. She decided to return that night at low tide under the cover of darkness. She wanted to see if the footprints would reappear. She wanted to understand what was happening in Whisperwind Cove. She returned to her cottage, her mind buzzing with questions. She tried to focus on her work, on analyzing data, on writing reports, but the image of the footprints, the unsettling feeling of the cove, kept intruding. As darkness fell, she prepared for her return to Whisperwind Cove. She put on warm clothes, sturdy boots, and a headlamp. She grabbed her phone, a small digital recorder, and a notebook. She felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension, a sense of venturing into the unknown. She walked to the cove under the cloak of a starless night. The wind was cold, carrying the scent of salt and something else, something indefinably strange. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks was amplified in the darkness. A constant, rhythmic roar. She reached the cove, her headlamp cutting a swathe through the darkness. The tide was out, revealing a wide expanse of wet, black sand. She scanned the area, her heart pounding. And then she saw them, the footprints, in the same location as before, near the water's edge. But they weren't just there. They were appearing. She watched, mesmerized and terrified, as the sand slowly, inexorably, depressed under an invisible weight, forming the distinct shape of a large humanoid footprint. Then another and another and another. They were forming a circle, a ring of footprints around a central point. She felt a cold dread grip her. She wanted to run, to escape, but she couldn't. She was frozen in place, her eyes fixed on the unfolding spectacle. She heard a sound, a low, guttural breathing coming from everywhere. It was like the sound of some enormous creature, inhaling and exhaling in slow, rhythmic cycles. She turned her head, searching for the source of the sound, but she saw nothing. Only the darkness, the rocks, the waves, and the ever-expanding circle of footprints. The breathing grew louder, closer. She felt a pressure in the air, a sense of being surrounded, of being watched. She felt a cold, clammy hand grip her ankle. She screamed, a short, sharp cry that was swallowed by the wind and the waves. She tried to pull away, but the grip was too strong. She looked down, expecting to see a hand, a claw, something tangible. But there was nothing, only her own leg, her own boot, sinking slightly into the wet sand. But the pressure remained, a cold, constricting force that held her fast. She struggled, kicking and twisting, trying to break free. The invisible hand tightened its grip, pulling her towards the center of the circle, towards the source of the breathing. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that she was in grave danger. She was facing something unknown, something unseen, something that defied all logic and reason. And she was utterly alone. Isabel thrashed, panic surging through her veins. The invisible grip on her ankle was relentless, dragging her slowly but surely towards the center of the circle of footprints. She could feel the cold, wet sand against her skin, the gritty texture scraping against her boot. She tried to scream again, but the sound died in her throat, choked by fear. She looked around wildly, searching for something, anything that could help her. But there was nothing, only the darkness, the rocks, the waves, and the ever-present, guttural breathing that seemed to surround her. She remembered the digital recorder in her pocket. She fumbled for it, her fingers clumsy and numb with cold. She managed to switch it on, hoping to capture some evidence of what was happening, some proof of the unseen force that was holding her captive. She held the recorder out in front of her, pointing it in the direction of the breathing, of the footprints, of the unseen presence. She could hear her own ragged breathing, the pounding of her heart, the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks. And then she heard something else, a voice, faint, distorted, but undeniably a voice. It was coming from the recorder. "Leave," the voice whispered, a chilling, sibilant sound that seemed to penetrate her very bones. "Leave this place." Isabel froze, her blood turning to ice. The voice was familiar, sounded like her own voice, but twisted, distorted, filled with a cold, alien malice. She tried to speak, to ask who was there, what was happening, but her voice wouldn't work. She could only gasp, her lungs burning, her chest tight with fear. The invisible grip on her ankle tightened, pulling her closer to the center of the circle. She could feel the sand shifting beneath her feet, as if something were moving, something large and heavy, just beneath the surface. She struggled again, kicking and thrashing, but it was no use. She was losing her balance, falling, being dragged down into the cold, wet sand. She saw for a fleeting moment a shape in the darkness, a large, amorphous form, rising from the sand, towering over her. It had no discernible features, no eyes, no mouth, just a dark, indistinct mass that seemed to absorb the light. And then, everything went black. She woke up on the beach, the cold, gray light of dawn illuminating the cove. She was lying on her back, her clothes soaked and covered in sand, her body aching and bruised. The footprints were gone. The tide had come in, washing away all traces of the night's terror. The cove looked peaceful, almost serene. She sat up, her head throbbing, her mind reeling. She looked around, searching for any sign of what had happened, any evidence of the unseen presence, the invisible grip, the chilling voice. But there was nothing, only the sand, the rocks, the waves, and the faint, metallic scent that still lingered in the air. She found her digital recorder lying a few feet away, half buried in the sand. She picked it up, her hands trembling, and pressed the play button. She heard the sound of the waves, the wind, her own ragged breathing. And then she heard the voice, her own voice, twisted and distorted, whispering those chilling words, "Leave this place." She listened to it again and again and again, trying to make sense of it, trying to understand what had happened. But she couldn't. It was beyond her comprehension, beyond the realm of science and reason. She got to her feet, her legs shaky and weak. She stumbled out of the cove, away from the black sand, away from the unseen presence, away from the haunting whispers. She returned to her cottage, her body numb, her mind reeling. She took a long, hot shower, trying to wash away the cold, the fear, the lingering sense of dread. But it was no use. The experience had changed her, had shattered her sense of security, her belief in the natural order of things. She had encountered something truly terrifying, something that defied all explanation. She packed her belongings, her hands still trembling. She left the cottage, left Port Blossom, left the seaside village and its unsettling secrets behind. She drove away, not looking back, the image of the cove, the footprints, the unseen presence, forever burned into her memory. She knew she would never forget that night, the night she had encountered something beyond human understanding, something that lurked in the darkness, in the whispers of the wind, in the depths of the sea, and in the chilling echo of her own voice. The cove remained, waiting, the yacht of nightmares, a descent into oceanic terror. This story, this harrowing account of survival against all odds, is one I rarely share. The memories are too vivid, the emotions too raw, the experience too profoundly unsettling to be recounted lightly. It's a tale of a dream vacation turned nightmare, a descent into primal fear, and a confrontation with the vast, unforgiving power of the ocean. It's a story that, even now, years later, can trigger a cold sweat, a racing heart, and a deep-seated aversion to anything that floats. It began with a stroke of incredible luck, a seemingly impossible victory in a local raffle. The prize? A 2-day yacht tour, a luxurious escape from the mundane realities of everyday life, a chance to experience the opulence and tranquility of the open sea. I, Olivia, had never won anything of significance in my life. My existence was defined by a certain ordinariness, a lack of extraordinary events or remarkable achievements. So when I entered the contest, a casual act of hopeful optimism, I did so with the full expectation of losing. The odds, I imagined, were astronomical. Thousands of entries, vying for a mere 2 coveted spots. It was a lottery, a game of chance, and I had never been particularly fortunate in such endeavors. So when the notification arrived, informing me that I had, in fact, won, I was stunned. Disbelief warred with elation, a cocktail of emotions that left me feeling both exhilarated and strangely apprehensive. It was too good to be true. Felt like a dream, a surreal departure from the predictable trajectory of my life. The prize included a guest, and I naturally chose my partner, Daniel, a man whose calm demeanor and unwavering support had been a constant source of strength in my life. The other winner, a man named Robert, brought his wife, Carol, a lively, outgoing couple who seemed to exude an infectious enthusiasm for life. We met on the dock, a scene of bustling activity, of gleaming white vessels bobbing gently in the turquoise water. The air was thick with the salty tang of the sea, the cries of gulls overhead, and the distant rumble of boat engines. We were introduced to the captain, a seasoned mariner with weathered hands and eyes that seemed to reflect the vastness of the ocean, and his first mate, a younger man with a quiet, efficient manner. The owner of the boat rental shop, a jovial, gregarious fellow, was also present, eager to ensure that his prize winners were well taken care of. We underwent a brief safety orientation, a perfunctory overview of emergency procedures, a routine that, at the time, seemed almost unnecessary, a mere formality before the real adventure began. We were given a tour of the yacht, a vessel that, while not exactly the epitome of luxury I had initially envisioned, was certainly comfortable enough. It was older, smaller than the megayachts one might see gracing the pages of glossy magazines, but it possessed a certain charm, a sense of understated elegance. I remember feeling a slight pang of disappointment when I saw our cabin, a cramped, windowless space that barely accommodated the two narrow beds. But I quickly dismissed the feeling, reminding myself that I was, after all, on a free yacht tour, a prize I had won through sheer luck. Complaining seemed ungrateful. We set sail at 3:30 p.m., the yacht gliding smoothly out of the harbor, leaving the land behind, venturing into the vast, boundless expanse of the open sea. The feeling was exhilarating, a sense of freedom, of liberation, that washed over me as the coastline receded into the distance. By 6 p.m., we were miles offshore, the land a distant memory, the world reduced to a seamless expanse of water and sky. The view from the upper deck was breathtaking, a panorama of unparalleled beauty. The water, a deep, indigo blue, stretched out to the horizon, meeting the sky in a perfectly straight line, creating the illusion of an edge, a precipice beyond which lay nothingness. A lone cargo ship, a distant speck on the horizon, was the only other sign of human presence, a reminder of the vastness, the isolation of our surroundings. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange, pink, and purple, a spectacular display of natural artistry that seemed to unfold just for us. We gathered on the deck, sharing champagne and stories with Robert and Carol, our laughter echoing across the still waters. We marveled at our good fortune, at the sheer improbability of our presence in this idyllic setting. Felt like a dream, a surreal escape from the mundane realities of our lives. Dinner was served, a delicious meal prepared by the captain, enjoyed under the stars, the gentle rocking of the yacht adding to the sense of tranquility. Conversation flowed easily, fueled by alcohol and the shared excitement of our adventure. We felt like royalty, pampered guests on a private vessel, sailing towards an unknown horizon. Around 9 p.m., Daniel and I retreated to our cabin, eager to get a good night's sleep. We planned to wake up early, to take advantage of the calm morning waters for a swim, a bit of exercise before the day's activities began. We were asleep by 11 p.m., lulled by the gentle rocking of the yacht and the distant hum of the engine. Then, at 1 a.m., the nightmare began. A loud, insistent banging on our cabin door jolted us awake. An alarm, shrill and piercing, blared through the yacht, its sound amplified by the confined spaces. A red light, flashing ominously, illuminated our tiny cabin, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. We scrambled out of bed, our hearts pounding, our minds racing. What was happening? Was this a drill? A false alarm? Daniel, ever the pragmatist, reached for the door handle, his hand trembling slightly. As soon as he opened it, we were confronted with a scene of controlled chaos. The first mate and the other couple, Robert and Carol, were standing in the narrow hallway, their faces pale, their eyes wide with alarm. They were hastily donning life jackets, bright orange vests that seemed strangely out of place in this luxurious setting. The first mate thrust 2 life jackets towards us, his movements urgent, his expression grim. "Put these on," he said, his voice terse, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Now." The smell of smoke, acrid and unmistakable, filled the air. It was a smell that instantly triggered a primal fear, a deep-seated dread that bypassed all rational thought. My mind struggled to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. This was a dream, a nightmare, a cruel, twisted joke. Yachts don't just catch fire. And even if they did, surely there were safety measures, procedures, protocols to prevent such a catastrophe. But the reality, the undeniable, terrifying reality, was staring us in the face. We rushed out of the cabin, following the first mate and the other couple towards the deck. And that's when we saw it. Flames. Massive, roaring flames, engulfing one half of the yacht, consuming everything in their path. The fire, a raging inferno, illuminated the night sky, casting an eerie, orange glow on the surrounding water. The heat was intense, radiating outwards, forcing us to shield our faces. The yacht was sinking, slowly, inexorably. It was descending into the dark, unforgiving depths of the ocean. The only light came from the fire and the stars, a stark juxtaposition of destructive force and celestial beauty. Anything beyond a 50-foot radius was shrouded in absolute darkness, an abyss that seemed to stretch on forever. The water, once a calming, reflective surface, now glowed orange, reflecting the inferno that consumed our vessel. The gentle lapping of waves against the hull, a sound I had found so soothing just hours before, now seemed ominous, a constant reminder of the watery grave that awaited us. The captain was frantically preparing the emergency raft, a small, inflatable vessel that seemed woefully inadequate for the task at hand. It was a bright yellow, a beacon of hope in the midst of this unfolding disaster, but it was also a symbol of our desperation, of our utter reliance on this flimsy piece of equipment for survival. He pulled on a cord, and the raft inflated with a hiss, expanding rapidly to its full size. A 4-foot by 6-foot rectangle of rubber and nylon, our only hope of escaping the fiery demise of the yacht. They threw it over the side, near a small set of metal stairs that led down to the water. A thin rope secured the raft to the yacht, preventing it from drifting away in the current. Meanwhile, I stood there, paralyzed by fear, my mind struggling to comprehend the sheer scale of the disaster. Tears streamed down my face, mingling with the sweat that beaded on my forehead. All I could think about were my dogs, my beloved companions, waiting for me back home, unaware of the terrifying ordeal I was facing. The captain and the first mate were engaged in a hushed, urgent conversation, their voices barely audible above the roar of the fire and the blaring of the alarm. Their faces were grim, their expressions betraying a sense of what? Despair? Resignation? I couldn't help but wonder what they were saying, what they weren't telling us. Were we doomed? Was this the end? After what felt like an eternity, the captain shouted, his voice hoarse with urgency, "Everyone onto the raft, one at a time." It was a scene straight out of a disaster movie, a moment of pure, unadulterated chaos. I half expected him to add, "Women and children first," but he didn't. The first mate climbed into the raft, extending his hand to help Carol down the treacherous metal stairs. Robert, his face etched with worry, held onto his wife's other hand, guiding her, supporting her, his love and concern evident in every gesture. Robert followed, and then it was my turn. I descended the stairs, my legs trembling, my hands gripping the cold metal railing. Daniel followed close behind, his presence a source of comfort in this terrifying ordeal. The captain tossed a single oar into the raft, a pathetically inadequate tool for navigating the vast expanse of the ocean. He untied the rope, gave us a shove, a desperate attempt to distance us from the burning yacht, and then leaped into the raft himself. The first mate, using the solitary oar, began to paddle, frantically trying to propel us away from the flames, from the smoke, from the sinking vessel that had, just hours before, been our luxurious sanctuary. The first few minutes were silent, save for the sound of the fire, the lapping of the waves, and the frantic paddling of the first mate. Robert was comforting Carol, his arms wrapped around her, his voice a low, soothing murmur. I, meanwhile, sat there, staring at the burning yacht, my mind numb, my body trembling. I expected an explosion, a dramatic, cinematic climax to this unfolding tragedy. But it never came. The yacht just burned, slowly, relentlessly, the flames gradually diminishing as the water, the relentless, unforgiving water, claimed its prize. After about 20 minutes, the fire was out, extinguished by the very element that was now our greatest threat. The only evidence of the once proud vessel was a smoldering, charred wreckage, slowly sinking beneath the waves. And then the darkness descended. The moon, a sliver of silver in the vast expanse of the night sky, offered little illumination. We were surrounded by absolute blackness, a void that seemed to stretch on forever, in every direction. We could barely see each other, our faces reduced to pale, indistinct shapes in the faint moonlight. The first mate, his voice strained, made his way around the raft, checking our life jackets, ensuring they were securely fastened. I appreciated his concern, his professionalism, but I couldn't help but feel a sense of annoyance. "I'll be fine without a life jacket," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. It was a foolish, irrational statement, born of a desperate need to assert some control, some agency, in a situation where I had none. The captain, meanwhile, was rummaging through a small compartment built into the side of the raft. He pulled out a piece of material, a spare patch of rubber, and a bright orange flare gun. It was a moment of hope, a glimmer of possibility in the midst of this overwhelming despair. He maneuvered to the edge of the raft, lifted up the side, and that's when we heard it. A gurgling sound, the sound of air escaping, of water intruding, of our flimsy sanctuary being compromised. There was a hole, a tear, a breach in the very fabric of our survival. The captain, his face etched with frustration and despair, tried to pull the side of the raft up to stem the flow of water to buy us some time. But it was a futile effort. The weight of his body, the lack of leverage, the relentless pressure of the ocean, it was all working against him. The first mate joined him, attempting to assist, but their combined efforts were in vain. The tear was too large, the damage too extensive. They tried to patch it using the spare piece of rubber and a clear adhesive seal. But the wet, slippery surface of the raft, the constant motion of the waves, made it impossible to create a secure bond. The patch wouldn't hold. After a few minutes of desperate, frantic effort, they gave up. The reality of our situation, the sheer, unadulterated horror of it, began to sink in. We were stranded, miles from shore, in the middle of the ocean, in a sinking life raft, with a single oar, and a flare gun that had, so far, failed to attract any attention. The raft continued to lose air, the inflated sides growing soft, yielding under the pressure of our weight. The water, cold and unforgiving, began to seep in, soaking our clothes, chilling us to the bone. We were about to be submerged, cast adrift in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the ocean, at the mercy of the currents, the waves, and the creatures that lurked beneath the surface. And then, as if the situation wasn't already terrifying enough, we learned that we were near the southern end of the Mariana Trench, the deepest part of the ocean, a place of unimaginable pressure, of eternal darkness, of creatures that defied comprehension. The thought of it, of the sheer, unfathomable depth beneath us, sent a shiver of pure terror down my spine. Miles of water, a crushing weight, a world of unseen horrors, separated us from the solid ground. The raft continued to sink, slowly, inexorably. We watched, our eyes fixed on the yellow fabric, as it gradually disappeared beneath the waves, a symbol of our dwindling hope, of our impending doom. 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet. The yellow became a pale, indistinct blur, fading into the darkness until, finally, it was gone. We were in the water, floating, helpless, surrounded by the vast, unforgiving expanse of the ocean. It was the most terrifying experience of my life. The water was shockingly cold, despite the initial warmth of the air. It seeped into my clothes, clinging to my skin, seeking warmth, comfort, and a semblance of security in numbers. I don't know if it was a conscious decision, a deliberate attempt to scare myself, or simply an involuntary reflex, but my mind began to conjure up images of what lurked beneath us. The Mariana Trench, the deepest part of the ocean, a realm of unimaginable pressure and perpetual darkness, was, we had been told, just a short distance away. It was a place where sunlight never penetrated, where creatures existed that defied the imagination, adapted to an environment so hostile, so alien, that it seemed to belong to another world. I am, and have always been, an avid viewer of Shark Week, that annual television event that both fascinates and terrifies me. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that sharks were more active at night, at dawn, and at dusk. We were, in essence, prime targets, floating helplessly in their hunting grounds, our bodies silhouetted against the faint glow of the moon. Every splash, every ripple, every unseen movement in the water sent a jolt of fear through me. I imagined sharks circling below, their senses heightened, their predatory instincts triggered by our presence. I envisioned myself being dragged down, down, down into the inky blackness, my screams muffled by the water, my body disappearing into the abyss. I knew, rationally, that the chances of a shark attack were relatively slim. But rationality had little place in this situation. Fear, primal and overwhelming, had taken control, hijacking my senses, amplifying every sound, every movement, every perceived threat. I remembered, with a sudden, desperate hope, the advice often given to those who encounter sharks. Don't panic, don't splash, don't resemble a seal. I tried to control my breathing, to minimize my movements, to present as unappetizing a target as possible. I even, in a moment of sheer irrational desperation, removed my earrings, small silver hoops, and tossed them into the water, away from our group. It was a futile, almost comical gesture, based on the dubious notion that the shiny objects might distract any nearby sharks, drawing their attention away from us. I know now how ridiculous that sounds, but at the time, in that state of heightened fear, it seemed like a perfectly logical course of action. I was grasping at straws, clinging to any shred of hope, any possibility of survival. We floated, hour after agonizing hour. The darkness was absolute, the silence broken only by the gentle lapping of the waves, the occasional splash of an unseen creature, and the frantic beating of our hearts. Time seemed to lose all meaning, stretching into an eternity of fear and uncertainty. I tried to distract myself, to focus on anything other than the terrifying reality of our situation. I thought about my family, my friends, my dogs. I imagined myself back home, safe and warm, surrounded by the familiar comforts of my life. But these thoughts were fleeting, easily overwhelmed by the crushing weight of my fear. Then, slowly, gradually, the sky began to lighten. The first hints of dawn, a faint, pale glow on the eastern horizon, began to dispel the absolute darkness. The sun, our life-giving star, was returning, promising warmth, visibility, and, perhaps, rescue. The arrival of daylight, while a welcome relief from the oppressive darkness, did little to alleviate my fear. If anything, it intensified it. Now I could see the vast expanse of the ocean surrounding us, the endless horizon, the absence of any sign of land, of any other vessel. I could also see, or at least I thought I could see, the creatures that lurked beneath the surface. I decided, in a moment of morbid curiosity, to do a 360-degree turn, to survey our surroundings, to assess the situation with a clear, unblinking gaze. And that's when it happened. The moment that would forever be etched in my memory. The moment that would solidify my fear of the ocean, of the unseen creatures that dwell within its depths. Something bumped my leg. Something large. Something solid. A scream, raw and primal, tore from my throat. It was a sound born of pure, unadulterated terror. A sound that echoed across the still waters. Big! I shrieked, my voice hoarse, my words fragmented. My leg! Shark! I couldn't be sure it was a shark. I hadn't seen it, had only felt the impact, the sudden, jarring contact with something substantial. But in my panicked state, in the context of our terrifying ordeal, I assumed the worst. My mind conjured up images of great white sharks, of tiger sharks, of all the terrifying predators I had seen on Shark Week, their jaws agape, their teeth bared, their eyes cold and lifeless. We all reacted instinctively, huddling closer together, our bodies pressed tight as if seeking safety in numbers. We scanned the water, our eyes darting nervously, searching for any sign of the creature, any indication of its intentions. Then Robert, the older gentleman, let out a yelp. He too had been bumped. A quick splash, a fleeting glimpse of something breaking the surface, a few feet away, revealed a large, dark fin. Was it a shark? A dolphin? We couldn't tell. The fin disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving us in a state of heightened anxiety, our hearts pounding, our minds racing. Remembering the advice I had so desperately clung to earlier, tried to remain still, to avoid attracting any further attention. I knew that sharks were attracted to movement, to splashing, to anything that might resemble a struggling, injured animal. We waited, our bodies tense, our senses on high alert. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Every ripple, every shadow, every unseen movement in the water sent a fresh wave of fear through us. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the fin was gone. We saw no further sign of the creature, no indication of its presence. But the fear remained, a palpable, suffocating presence that clung to us like a shroud. We were all exhausted, dehydrated, and increasingly sunburned. The hours of exposure to the elements, to the relentless sun, were taking their toll. My girlfriend, Daniel, his skin normally a healthy tan, was now a painful shade of red. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her eyes sunken and bloodshot. I pulled off my shirt, a thin, cotton garment that offered little protection from the sun, and used it to create a makeshift shade for her, a desperate attempt to shield her from the relentless glare. I was shirtless, exposed, my skin already beginning to burn, but I didn't care. Her well-being was my only concern. The thought of rescue, of being found, of returning to solid ground, seemed increasingly distant, increasingly unlikely. I began to spiral, my mind succumbing to despair, to the overwhelming sense of hopelessness. Is nobody else concerned about dehydration? I snapped, my voice sharp, my words directed at no one in particular. It was a moment of weakness, a lapse in composure, a reflection of the intense stress and fear I was experiencing. I knew I was being unfair, that my companions were suffering just as much as I was, that they were coping in their own way. But I couldn't help it. The fear, the uncertainty, the sheer, unadulterated terror of our situation had overwhelmed me. And then a sound, a loud, unmistakable sound, a horn, a ship's horn. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was a sound that spoke of hope, of rescue, of salvation. We all looked up, our eyes scanning the horizon, searching for the source of the sound. And there it was, cargo ship, a massive, red-hulled vessel, appearing on the horizon, growing larger with each passing moment. It was coming towards us. The captain fired the last flare, a final, desperate plea for help. The flare arced through the sky, a bright orange streak against the azure backdrop, leaving a trail of smoke in its wake. The ship's horn sounded again, twice this time, a signal that they had seen us, that they were aware of our presence. Relief, profound and overwhelming, washed over me. It was a feeling so intense, so powerful, that it almost brought me to my knees. We were going to be rescued. We were going to survive. The cargo ship approached, its massive hull dwarfing our tiny, huddled group. They threw over floating devices, ropes, anything that might help us stay afloat. And then we saw the helicopter, a Coast Guard helicopter, approaching from the opposite direction, its rotors beating the air, creating a downdraft that whipped the water into a frenzy. They lowered a rescuer, a man in a bright orange suit, who expertly attached each of us to a stretcher, one by one, and hoisted us up into the safety of the helicopter. As we were being lifted, the helicopter hovered over the wreckage site, the remnants of the yacht, now just a scattering of debris on the surface of the water. I looked down, my eyes scanning the scene, my mind still reeling from the events of the past few hours. And that's when I saw them. Sharks. Multiple sharks, their bodies sleek and dark, circling the wreckage, their fins cutting through the water, their presence a chilling reminder of the danger we had so narrowly escaped. The Coast Guard rescuer, noticing my gaze, made a comment that would forever be etched in my memory. "This area is notorious for shark activity," he said, his voice calm, matter of fact. "You all are lucky to have made it out alive, and with all limbs intact. There were quite a few sharks swimming near the area we picked you up." One, his words, though intended to be reassuring, sent a fresh wave of fear through me. I had been right. There had been sharks, and we had been floating helpless in their hunting grounds for hours. I didn't respond, couldn't. The words caught in my throat, the image of those sharks circling beneath us, a chilling reminder of our vulnerability, of our near miss with a fate far worse than dehydration or sunburn. I unbuckled my life vest, the bright orange fabric now feeling like a symbol of our ordeal, and turned to the Coast Guard rescuer. "Do you have a shirt I could borrow?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. It was a mundane request, a trivial concern in the grand scheme of things. But it was all I could think of, a small act of normalcy in the midst of this extraordinary, terrifying experience. The flight back to land was a blur. I remember the noise of the helicopter, the salty spray of the ocean, the feeling of being suspended between the sky and the sea. I remember the relief, the profound, overwhelming relief of finally setting foot on solid ground. And I remember the vow I made, a silent, solemn promise to myself. I would never, ever set foot on a boat again. The ocean, once a symbol of beauty and tranquility, had become a source of primal fear, a reminder of the darkness that lurks beneath the surface, of the dangers that await the unwary. And I, Olivia, would forever be wary, forever haunted by the memory of the yacht of nightmares, of the night I descended into oceanic terror and, against all odds, survived.